Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring the military. Sentry by Fredric Brown. The Foxholes of Mars by Fritz Leiber. The Overlord's Thumb by Robert Silverberg. The Way Out by Richard Rein Smith. Weapon by J.F. Bone.
Sentry by Fredric Brown. Originally published in Galaxy Science Fiction, February 1954. Narrated by Tom Trussell. He was wet and muddy and hungry and cold, and he was 50,000 light years from home. A strange blue sun gave light, and the gravity, twice what he was used to, made every movement difficult. But in tens of thousands of years, this part of war hadn't changed. The flyboys were fine with their sleek spaceships and their fancy weapons. When the chips are down, though, it was still the foot soldier, the infantry, that had to take the ground and hold it, foot by bloody foot. Like this damned planet of a star he'd never heard of until they landed him there. And now it was sacred ground, because the aliens were there too. The aliens, the only other intelligent race in the galaxy, cruel, hideous, and repulsive monsters. Contact had been made with them near the center of the galaxy after the slow, difficult colonization of 12,000 planets, and it had been war at sight. They'd shot without even trying to negotiate or to make peace. Now, planet by bitter planet, it was being fought out. He was wet and muddy and hungry and cold, and the day was raw with a high wind that hurt his eyes. But the aliens were trying to infiltrate, and every sentry post was vital. He stayed alert, gun ready, 50,000 light years from home, fighting on a strange world and wondering if he'd ever live to see home again. And then he saw one of them, crawling toward him. He drew a bead and fired. The alien made that strange, horrible sound they all make, then lay still. He shuddered at the sound and sight of the alien lying there. One ought to be able to get used to them after a while, but he'd never been able to. Such repulsive creatures they were, with only 2 arms and 2 legs, ghastly white skins, and no scales.
The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
The Foxholes of Mars by Fritz Leiber. Originally published in Thrilling Wonder Stories, June 1952. Narrated by Tom Trussell. Ever inward from the jagged horizon the machines of death crept, edged, scurried, rocketed and tunnelled towards him. It seemed as if all this purple sunned creation had conspired to isolate, to smash him. To the west, for all planets share a west if nothing else, the nuclear bombs bloomed, meaningless giant fungi. Invisibly overhead the spaceships roared, distant as gods, yet shaking the yellow sky. Even the soil was treacherous, nauseated by artificial earthquakes. Nobody's mother, least of all an Earthman's. "Why don't you cheer up?" the others had said to him. "It's a mad planet." But he would not cheer up, for he knew what they said was literally true. Soon they would fall back, and the enemy would retake the mangled thing they called an objective. Was it the 6th time? The 7th? And did the soldiers on the other side have 6 legs or 8? The enemy were pretty haphazard as to what troops they used in this sector. Worse was the noise. Meaningless mechanical screeches tore at his skull, until thoughts rattled around in it like dry seeds in a dry pod. He started to lift his hands to his ears, then checked the gesture, convulsed with soundless laughter and tearless weeping, bitter memories and searing hatred. Once there had been a galactic society, a galactic empire, and he had played an unnoticed part on one of its nice, quiet planets. But now? Galactic empire? Galactic horse dung. Perhaps he had always hated his fellow men as much as he did now, but in the pre-war days his hatred had been closely bound and meticulously repressed. It was still bound, tighter than ever, but it was no longer repressed. The deadly engine he tended, silent for a moment, began again to chatter to those of the enemy. Its voice was nearly drowned by their booming ones, like a spiteful child in a crush of complacent adults. It turned out they had been covering a withdrawal of Martian sappers, and must now escape as best they might. They began to retreat. The officer running beside him fell. He hesitated. The officer cursed a new useless joint that had appeared in his leg. All the others, including the black-shelled Martians, were ahead. He glanced around, fearfully, tormentedly, as if he were about to commit a hideous crime. Then he lifted the officer and staggered on, reeling like a top at the end of its spin. He was still grinning in a spasmic way when they reached the security of lesser danger. Even when the officer thanked him with curt sincerity, he couldn't stop grinning. Nevertheless, they gave him the Order of Planetary Merit for that. He stared at the watery soup and meat shreds in his mess tin. The cellar was cool, and its seats, though built for creatures with 4 legs and 2 arms, were comfortable. The purple daylight was pleasantly muted. The noise had gone a little way off, playing cat and mouse. He was alone. Of course, life had never had any meaning, except for the chillingly sardonic one perceptible to the demons in the nuclear bombs and the silver giants in space who pushed the buttons. And he had no stomach to aspire to that. They'd had 10,000 years to fix things, those giants, and still all they could tell you was to go dig yourself a hole. In the old days, the possibility of relaxation and petty self-indulgence against the magnificent sham background of galactic empire had permitted him to pretend life had a meaning. Yet, at a time like this, when such an illusion was needful, it ran out on you, jeered at you along with the lesser lies it had nurtured. A 3-legged creature skipped out of the shadows, halted at a distance, and subtly intimated it would like food. At first he thought it must be some Rigelian tripedal, but then he saw it was an earth cat lacking a leg. Its movements were grotesque but efficient, and not without a certain gracefulness. How it could have got to this planet he found it hard to imagine. But you don't worry about that, or even about other cats. 3 legs, he thought bitterly. You hunt alone. You mate with your own kind when you can, but then only because it's most agreeable. You don't set up your own species as a corporate divinity and worship it, and yearn over the light centuries of its empire, and eat out your heart because of it, and humbly spill your blood at its cosmic altar. Nor are you hoodwinked when the dogs bark about the greatness of humanity under 1,000 different moons, or when the dumb cattle sigh from surfeit and gracefully chew their cuds under red, green, and purple suns. You accept us as something sometimes helpful. You walk into our spaceships as you walked up to our fires. You use us. But when we're gone, you won't pine on our graves or starve in the pen. You'll manage, or try to. The cat mewed. He tossed it a bit of meat which it caught in his teeth, shifting about cleverly on the 2 good hind legs. As he watched it daintily nibble through scrawny with famine, he suddenly saw Kenneth's face, just as he had last seen it on Alpha Centauri Duo. It seemed very real, projected against the maroon darkness towards the other end of the cellar. The full, tolerant lips lined at the corners, the veiledly appraising eyes, the space sallow skin were all exactly as they had been when they roomed together at the sign of the burnt-out jet. But there was a richness and a zest about the face that he had missed before. He did not try to move toward the illusion, though he wanted to. He only looked. Then there came the sound of boots on the floor above, and the cat bounded away, humping its hindquarters quite like a tripedal, and the vision quickly faded. For a long time he sat staring at the spot where it had been, feeling a strangely poignant unhappiness, as if the only worthwhile being in the world had died. Then he started to eat his food with the vague curiosity of a 2-year-old, sometimes pausing with the spoon halfway to his mouth. It was night, and there was a ground mist, through which the vine-coloured moons showed like 2 sick eyes, and anything might have been moving in the shadows. He squinted and peered over the rim of the trench, but it was hard to make out the nature of any object. The landscape was so torn and distorted. 3 men came out of the place of underground concealment to the left, joking together in hushed, hollow voices. One whom he knew well, a stocky soldier with big eyes and smirking lips and reddish stubble on his chin, greeted him with a friendly jibe about easy jobs. Then they wormed their way up and over, and started to crawl toward where enemy scouts, 6 or 8, were supposed to lie. He lost sight of them very quickly. He held his weapon ready, watching for the sight of the enemy. Why did he hate the soldiers of the enemy so little? No more than a Martian hunting sand dragons hates sand dragons. His relationship with them was limited, almost abstract. How could he hate something so different from himself in form? He could only marvel that it too had intelligence. No, the enemy were merely dangerous targets. Once he had seen one of them escape death, and it had made him feel happy. He had wanted to wave in a friendly way, even if it could at best have only wriggled a tentacle in return. But as for the men who fought side by side with him, he hated them bitterly, loathed their faces, voices, physical mannerisms, the way this one chewed and that one spat, their unchanging curses, clichés, and jokes, all unendurably magnified, as if his nose were being rubbed in offal, for they were part of the same miserable, lying, self-worshipping galactic swarm as himself. He wondered if he had hated the men at the office on Altair Luna in the same way. Almost certainly, he recalled the long smouldering irritations over trifles that had seemed tremendous in the hours between the violin moans of the time clock. But then there had been the safety valves and shock absorbers that make life tolerable, and also the illusion of purpose. But now there was nothing, and everybody knew it. They had no right to joke about it and continue their pretense. He was shaking with anger. To kill indiscriminately would at least demonstrate his feelings. To focus death on the backs of men charging with inane hysteria, to toss a nuclear fizz bomb into a dugout where men sought secret escape in dreams and repeated like prayers their rationalizations about galactic empires, dying at his hand, they might for a moment understand their own vicious hypocrisy. From out ahead, one of Death's little mechanisms spoke concisely, rapidly. It seemed like a bugle call that only he could hear. Ruby moonlight slid suddenly across the grotesquely tortured ground. He raised his weapon and took aim. Its sound pleased him because it was like a soft groan of agony. Then he realized he had fired at the abruptly revealed shadow because it was that of the stocky soldier who had jibed and crawled away. The moonlight blacked out as if a curtain had been drawn. His heart pounded. He ground his teeth and grinned. His feelings were fierce, but not yet determinate. He became aware of the smells of the ground and of the chemicals and metals, strong, sharp, interesting smells. Then he found himself staring at a whitish patch that never got more than 8 inches off the ground. Slowly it approached out of the darkness, like the inquisitive head of a huge ghost worm. It became a face with big eyes and smirking lips, fretted with red stubble. Mechanically he reached out a hand and helped the man down into the trench. "Were you the one that winged him? That lousy spider would have gotten me sure. I didn't see him until he fell on me." This, then, was the end. Hereafter he would give in to the mob, run with the hounds, die purposelessly like a lemming when the time came. Never again would he aspire to the dark, icy insight that gave life a real, though horrible, meaning. He was a ridiculous little communal animal in a lemming horde racing across the galaxy, and he would live like one. He saw the small black object falling swiftly through the mist. The stocky soldier did not. There was a deafening blast that slapped the skin. Looking up, he saw the stocky soldier still standing there, without a head. As the body stumbled blindly forward, tripped and fell, he began to laugh in little hissing gusts through his teeth. His lips were drawn back, so that his jaw muscles twitched and pained him. He felt contemptuous amusement at the blonde soldier. The blonde soldier had been to a third-rate nuclear technic school of some sort and believed it had been a serious mistake to put him in the infantry. Nevertheless, the blonde soldier was ambitious and took an unusual interest in the war. They stood alone at the crest of a ridge thick with violet and yellow spotted vines. In the valleys on either side, the units were pushing forward. Trails of dust and tracks of mashed vines extended as far as the eye could see. Various huge engines trompled forward, carrying men, and other men ran fussily about, freeing engines that had met with some stop or hindrance, as if the two were inextricably united in an unimaginable symbiosis. Small machines, bearing messengers, went swiftly to and fro, like centaurs, a superior type of individual. Other machines spied watchfully overhead. It was like some vast, clumsy monster feeling its way, cautiously putting out pseudopods or horns like a snail's, withdrawing them puzzledly when they touched anything hurtful or strange, but always gathering itself for a new effort. It did not flow, but humped and hedged and scuttled, like an army of Rigelian roaches, or the driver ants of Earth that were so like miniature Martians, with their black-weaponed soldiers, foragers, scouts, butchers, pack-carriers. And they were truly neither more nor less than ants. He was no more than an epidermal cell in a monster that was duelling with another monster, very careful of its inner organs, but careless about its epidermis. There was something comfortingly abstract and impersonal about the idea of being united in such a way with many other men, not because of any shared purpose, but merely because they belonged to the same monster, a monster so large that it could readily do duty for fate and necessity, the fellowship of protoplasm. The blonde soldier murmured 2 or 3 words, and for a moment he thought the whole army had spoken to him. Then he understood and made the necessary adjustment in the instrument they were setting up. But those 2 or 3 words had plunged him with breathtaking abruptness into the worst sort of inner misery. What was abstract had become personal, and that was bad. To conceive a monster made of men was one thing. To feel the insensate, inescapable prod of a neighbouring cell and realize the stifling, closed-packed pressure of the whole was another. He lifted his hand to a collar. The very air seemed to convey to his skin the shoving and jostling of distant invisible individuals, the nudge of the galactic horde. They were at the end of the crest now, atop a little hillock, and he stared ahead to where the unknown objectives lay and where the air was clearer. He felt as if he were suffocating. His new mood had come as utterly without warning as most of his moods now came, gushing up explosively from some wild, alien, ever-expanding dimension within him. Then, in the broad expanse of fantastically clouded sky ahead of him, he saw his friends' faces again, orderly and side by side, but gigantic, like a pantheon of demigods, just as he had in the cellar and several times since, only now all together. The only faces that meant anything in the cosmos. Black George with a wide grin that looked, but was not, stupid. Hollow-cheeked Lauren, peering up with shy canniness, about to argue. Dark Helen with her proud, subtle lips. Sallow Kenneth again, with his veiledly appraising eyes. And Albert and Maurice and Kate. And others whose features were blurred, heartbreakingly suggesting friends forgot, all transfigured and glowing with warmth and light, as meaningful as symbols, yet holding each within itself the quintessence of individuality. He stood stock still, beginning to tremble, feeling great guilt. How had he neglected and deserted them, his friends, the only ones deserving his loyalty, the only island for him in the cosmos-choking sea of humanity, the only ones with worth and meaning, compared to which race and creed and humanity were without significance. It was as self-evident and undeniable as a premise in mathematics. Heretofore he had seen only the masks of reality, the reflections, the counter-shadows. Now at a bound he stood beside the gods in darkness who pulled the wires. The vision faded, became part of his mind. He turned, and it was as if he saw the blonde soldier for the first time. How had he ever believed that he and the other soldier might have anything in common? The gulf between them was far greater than if they had belonged to different species. Why had he ever given two thoughts to such a silly, squinty-eyed, bustling little organism? He never would again. It was all very clear. "We'll get them this time," the other soldier said with conviction. "We've got the stuff now. We'll show the bugs. Come on." It was wonderful, hysterical, insufferable. Yesterday spiders, today bugs, tomorrow worms. The other soldier really believed it was important and noble. He could still pretend there was that kind of meaning and purpose to that sort of slaughter. "Come on, get the beta cycling," said the other soldier impatiently, nudging him. It was all very clear, and he would never lose that clarity. By one action he would cut himself off from the galactic pack and cleave forever to the faces in the sky. "Come on," ordered the other soldier, jerking at him. He unsheathed his weapon, touched a button. Silently a dull black spot, not a hole, appeared in the back of the blonde soldier's head. He hid the body, walked down the other side of the hill, and attached himself to another unit. By morning they were retreating again, the monster badly hurt and automatically resisting disillusion. He was an officer now. "I don't like him," said a soldier. "Of course they all try to scare you, whether they know it or not. Part of the business, but with him it's different. I know he doesn't talk tough, or threaten, or act grim. I know he's pleasant enough when he takes time to notice you, even sympathetic. But there's something there I can't put my finger on, something cold-blooded, like he wasn't even alive, or as if we weren't. Even when he acts especially decent or thoughtful toward me, I know he doesn't give a damn. It's his eyes. I can read meaning in the eyes of a Fulmenhortian blindworm, but I can't read anything in his. The soaring city seemed alien, though it had once been home. He liked it the better for that. Civilian clothes felt strange against his skin. He whisked briskly along the sidewalk, taking the turns aimlessly when it split at the pedestrian clover-leafs. He looked at the passing faces with frank inquisitiveness, as if he were at a zoo. He just wanted to enjoy the feeling of anonymity for a little while. He knew what he was going to do afterwards. There were his friends, and there were the animals. The fortunes of his friends were to be advanced. Beside the next clover-leaf was a speaker and a little crowd. There had been a good deal of that sort of stuff since the truce. Curiously he listened, recognized the weakness of the words. It was sloshed with ideas, tainted with unprofitable, poorly selected hatreds. The call to action was tinged by an undercurrent of bitterness that argued inaction would be better. They were civilized words, and therefore useless to one who wanted to become an animal trainer on a galactic scale. What a zoo he'd have some day, and every single beast in it advertised as intelligence. Other words and phrases began to ooze up into his mind. Thinkers! Listen to me! Cheated of what you deserve! Misled by misled men! The galactic runaround! This engineered truce! The creatures who use the war to consolidate their power! The cosmic declaration of servitude! Life to lose! Liberty to obey! And as for the pursuit of happiness, happiness is a light millennium ahead of all of us. Our universal rights, free Martia, terror for all, revenge. These unspoken words, he felt, were the harbingers of leadership. Alexander had done it, Hitler had done it, Smith had done it, Rivlath had done it, the Neuron had done it, the great Centaur had done it. All murderers, for only murderers won. He saw the brilliant light years of his future ahead, endlessly. He saw no details, but it was all of the same imperial colour. Never again would he hesitate. Each moment would decide something. Each of his future actions would drop like a grain of sand from an ancient hourglass, inevitable as time. Profound excitement seized him. The scene around him grew and grew until he seemed at the centre of a vast, ominous, spellbound crowd that filled the galaxy. The faces of his friends were close, eager and confident, and from a great distance, as if from beyond the stars, he seemed to see his own face staring back at him, pale, skull-eyed, and insatiably hungry.
The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
The Overlord's Thumb by Robert Silverberg. Originally published in Infinity, March 1958. Narrated by Tom Trissel. The sun had gone down blood red, and Colonel John Duval slept poorly because of it. The atmosphere on Markin was not normally conducive to blood-red sunsets, though they did happen occasionally on evenings when the blue of sunlight was scattered particularly well. The marks connected red sunsets with approaching trouble. Colonel Duval, who headed the Terran cultural and military mission to Markin, was more cultural than military himself, and so was willing to accept the Markin belief that the sunset was a premonition of conflict. He was tall, well-made, and erect in bearing, with the sharp, bright eyes and crisp manner of the military man. He successfully tried to project an appearance of authoritative officerhood, and his men respected and feared the image he showed them. His degree was in anthropology. The military education was an afterthought, but a shrewd one. It had brought him command of the Markin outpost. The Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs insisted that all missions to relatively primitive alien worlds be staffed and headed by military men. And, Duvall reasoned, so long as I keep up the outward show, who's to know that I'm not the tough soldier they think I am? Markin was a peaceful enough world. The natives were intelligent, fairly highly advanced culturally, if not technically, easily dealt with on a rational being-to-being basis. Which explains why Duvall slept badly the night of the Red Sun. Despite his elegant posture and comportment, he regarded himself essentially as a bookish, unmilitary man. He had some doubts as to his own possible behaviour in an unforeseen time of crisis. The false front of his officerhood might well crumble away under stress, and he knew it. He dozed off, finally, toward morning, having kicked the covers to the floor and twisted the sheets into crumpled confusion. It was a warmish night. Most of them were on Markin, but he felt chilled. He woke late, only a few minutes before officers' mess, and dressed hurriedly in order to get there on time. As commanding officer, of course, he had the privilege of sleeping as late as he pleased, but getting up with the others was part of the task Duvall imposed on himself. He donned the light summer uniform, slapped depilator hastily on his tanned face, hooked on his formal blaster and belt, and signalled to his orderly that he was awake and ready. The Terran enclave covered 10 acres, half an hour's drive from one of the largest Markin villages. An idling jeep waited outside Duvall's small private dome, and he climbed in, nodding curtly at the orderly. "Morning, Harris." "Good morning, sir. Sleep well?" It was a ritual by now. "Very well," Duvall responded automatically, as the jeep's turbos thrummed once and sent the little car humming across the compound to the mess hall. Clipped to the seat next to Duvall was his daily morning program sheet, prepared for him by the staffman of the day while he slept. This morning's sheet was signed by Dudley, a major of formidable efficiency, space service through and through, a military wing career man, and nothing else. Duvall scanned the assignments for the morning, neatly written out in Dudley's crabbed hand. Kelly, Dorfman, Mellers, Steber, on linguistic detail, as usual. Same assignment as yesterday, in town. Haskell on medic duty, blood samples, urinalysis. Matsuoka to maintenance staff, through Wednesday. Jolly on zoo detail. Leonards, Mayer, Rodriguez on assigned botanical field trip. 2 days. Extra jeep assigned for specimen collection. Duvall scanned the rest of the list, but, as expected, Dudley had done a perfect job of deploying the men where they would be most useful and most happy. Duvall thought briefly about Leonards on the botanical field trip. A 2-day trip might take them through the dangerous rainforest to the south. Duvall felt a faint flicker of worry. The boy was his nephew, his sister's son, a reasonably competent journeyman botanist with a gold bar still untarnished on his shoulder. This was the boy's first commission. He had been assigned to Duvall's unit at random, as a new man. Duvall had concealed his relationship to Leonards from the other men, knowing it might make things awkward for the boy, but he still felt a protective urge. Hell, the kid can take care of himself, Duvall thought, and scribbled his initials at the bottom of the sheet and clipped it back in place. It would be posted while the men were cleaning their quarters, and the officers ate, and by 0900 everyone would be out on his day's assignment. There was so much to do, Duvall thought, and so little time to do it. There were so many worlds. He quitted the jeep and entered the mess hall. Officers' mess was a small well-lit alcove to the left of the main hall. As Duvall entered, he saw 7 men standing stiffly at attention, waiting for him. He knew they hadn't been standing that way all morning. They had snapped to attention only when their lookout, probably Second Lieutenant Leonards, the youngest, had warned them he was coming. Well, he thought, it doesn't matter much, as long as appearance is preserved, the form. "Good morning, gentlemen," he said crisply, and took his place at the head of the table. For a while, it looked as if it were going to turn out a pretty good day. The sun rose in a cloudless sky, and the thermometer tacked to the Enclave flagstaff registered 93 degrees. When Markin got hot, it got hot. By noon, Duval knew by now, they could expect something like 110 in the shade, and then a slow, steady decline into the low 80s by midnight. The botanical crew departed on time, rumbling out of camp in its 2 jeeps, and Duval stood for a moment on the mess hall steps watching them go, watching the other men head for their assigned posts. Stubble-faced Sergeant Jolly saluted him as he trotted across the compound to the Sioux, where he would tend the little menagerie of Markin wildlife the expedition would bring back to Earth at termination. Wiry little Matsuoka passed by, dragging a carpenter's kit. The linguistic team climbed into its jeep and drove off toward town, where they would continue their studies in the Markin tongue. They were all busy. The expedition had been on Markin just 4 months. 8 months was left of their time. Unless an extension of stay came through, they'd pack up and return to Earth for 6 months of furlough come report session, and then it would be on to some other world for another year of residence. Duval was not looking forward to leaving Markin. It was a pleasant world, if a little on the hot side, and there was no way of knowing what the next world would be like. A frigid ball of frozen methane, perhaps, where they would spend their year bundled into Valdez breathing suits and trying to make contact with some species of intelligent ammonia-breathing mollusks. Better the devil we know, Duval felt. But he had to keep moving on. This was his 11th world, and there would be more to come. Earth had barely enough qualified survey teams to cover 10,000 worlds half adequately, and life abounded on 10 million. He would retain whichever members of the current team satisfied him by their performance, replace those who didn't fit in, and go off on his next job 8 months from now. He turned on the office fan and took down the logbook. Unfastening the binder, he slipped the first blank sheet into the autotype. For once he avoided his standard blunder. He cleared his throat before switching on the autotype, thereby sparing the machine its customary difficulties in finding a verbal equivalent for his The guide light glowed a soft red. Duval said, 4th April, 2705. Colonel John F. Duval recording. 119th day of our stay on Markin, World 7 of System 1106 Sub-A. Temperature, 93 at 0900. Wind gentle, southerly. He went on at considerable length, as he did each morning. Finishing off the required details, he gathered up the sheaf of specialty reports that had been left at his door the night before, and began to read abstracts into the log. The autotype clattered merrily, and a machine somewhere in the basement of the towering E.T. Affairs building in Rio de Janeiro was reproducing his words as the sub-radio hookup transmitted them. It was dull work. Duval often wondered whether he might have been ultimately happier doing simple anthropological fieldwork, as he had once done, instead of taking on the onerous burden of routine that an administrative post entailed. But someone has to shoulder the burden, he thought. Earthman's burden. We're the most advanced race. We help the others. But no one twists our arms to come out to these worlds and share what we have. Call it an inner compulsion. He intended to work until noon. In the afternoon, a Markin high priest was coming to the enclave to see him, and the interview would probably take almost till sundown. But about 1100 he was interrupted suddenly by the sound of jeeps unexpectedly entering the compound, and he heard the clamour of voices, both Terran voices and alien ones. A fearful argument seemed to be in progress, but the group was too far away, and Duval's knowledge of Markin too uncertain for him to be able to tell what was causing the rumpus. In some annoyance, he snapped off the autotype, rose from his chair, and peered through the window into the yard. 2 jeeps had drawn up, the botanical crew, gone less than 2 hours. 4 natives surrounded the 3 Earthmen. 2 of the natives clutched barbed spears. A 3rd was a woman, the 4th an old man. They were all protesting hotly over something. Duval scowled. From the pale, tense, unhappy faces of the men in the jeep, he could tell something was very wrong. That blood-red sunset had foretold accurately, he thought, as he dashed down the steps from his study. 7 pairs of eyes focused on him as he strode toward the group, 8 glittering alien eyes, warmly golden, and 6 shifting, uneasy Terran eyes. "What's going on out here?" Duval demanded. The aliens set up an immediate babble of noise, chattering away like a quartet of squirrels. Duval had never seen any of them behaving this way before. "Quiet!" he roared. In the silence that followed, he said very softly, "Lieutenant Leonards, can you tell me exactly what all this fuss is about?" The boy looked very frightened. His jaws were stiffly clenched, his lips bloodless. "Yes, sir," he said stammeringly. "Begging your pardon, sir, I seem to have killed an alien." In the relative privacy of his office, Duval faced them all again. Leonards, sitting very quietly staring at his gleaming boots. Maya and Rodriguez, who had accompanied him on the ill-starred botanizing journey. The aliens were outside. There would be time to calm them down later. "Okay," Duval said. "Leonards, I want you to repeat the story exactly as you just told it to me, and I'll get it down on the autotype. Start talking when I point to you." He switched on the autotype and said, "Testimony of Second Lieutenant Paul Leonards, botanist, delivered in presence of Commanding Officer on 4 April 2705. He jabbed a forefinger at Leonards. The boy's face looked waxy. Beads of sweat dotted his pale, vein-traced forehead, and his blonde hair was tangled and twisted. He clamped his lips together in an agonized grimace, scratched the back of one hand, and finally said, "Well, we left the Enclave about 0900 this morning, bound south and westerly on a tour of the outlying regions. Our purpose was to collect botanical specimens. I was in charge of the group, which also included Sergeants Maya and Rodriguez." He paused. We accomplished little in the first half hour. This immediate area had already been thoroughly covered by us anyway. But about 0945, Maya noticed a heavily wooded area not far to the left of the main road, and called it to my attention. I suggested we stop and investigate. It was impossible to penetrate the wooded area in our jeeps, so we proceeded on foot. I left Rodriguez to keep watch over our gear while we were gone. We made our way through a close-packed stand of deciduous angiosperm trees of a species we had already studied, and found ourselves in a secluded area of natural growth, including several species which we could see were previously uncatalogued. We found one in particular, a shrub consisting of a single thick succulent green stalk perhaps 4 feet high, topped by a huge golden-green composite flower head. We filmed it in detail, took scent samples, pollen prints, and removed several leaves. Duval broke in suddenly. "You didn't pick the flower itself?" Duval speaking. "Of course not. It was the only specimen in the vicinity, and it's not our practice to destroy single specimens for the sake of collecting. But I did remove several leaves from the stalk, and the moment I did that, a native sprang at me from behind a thick clump of ferns. He was armed with one of those notched spears. Maya saw him first and yelled, and I jumped back just as the alien came charging forward with his spear. I managed to deflect the spear with the outside of my arm and was not hurt. The alien fell back a few feet and shouted something at me in his language, which I don't understand too well as yet. Then he raised his spear and menaced me with it. I was carrying the standard issue radial blaster. I drew it and ordered him in his own language to lower his spear, that we meant no harm. He ignored me and charged a second time. I fired in self-defence, trying to destroy the spear or at worst wound his arm, but he spun round to take the full force of the charge and died instantly. Leonards shrugged. That's about it, sir. We came back here instantly. Duval speaking. Sergeant Meyer, would you say this account is substantially true? Meyer was a thin-faced, dark-haired man who was usually smiling, but he wasn't smiling now. This is Sergeant Meyer. I say that Lieutenant Leonards told the story substantially as it occurred, except that the alien didn't seem overly fierce despite his actions, in my opinion. I myself thought he was bluffing both times he charged, and I was a little surprised when Lieutenant Leonards shot him. That's all, sir. Frowning, the Colonel said, Duval speaking. This has been testimony in the matter of the alien killed today by Lieutenant Leonards. He snapped off the autotype, stood up, and leaned forward across the desk, staring sternly at the trio of young botanists facing him. These next few days are going to be my test, he thought tensely. Sergeant Rodriguez, since you weren't present at the actual incident, I'll consider you relieved of all responsibility in this matter, and your testimony won't be required. Report to Major Dudley for reassignment for the remainder of the week. Thank you, sir, Rodriguez saluted, grinned gratefully, and was gone. As for you two, though, Duval said heavily, you'll both have to be confined to base pending the outcome of the affair. I don't need to tell you how serious this can be, whether the killing was in self-defense or not. Plenty of peoples don't understand the concept of self-defense. He moistened his suddenly dry lips. I don't anticipate too many complications growing out of this, but these are alien people on an alien world, and their behavior is never certain. He glanced at Leonards. Lieutenant, I'll have to ask for your own safety that you remain in your quarters until further notice. Yes, sir. Is this to be considered arrest? Not yet, Duval said. Meyer, attach yourself to the maintenance platoon for the remainder of the day. We'll probably need your testimony again before this business is finished. Dismissed, both of you. When they were gone, Duval sank back limply in his web-phoned chair and stared at his fingertips. His hands were quivering as if they had a life of their own. John F. Duval, Ph.D. Anthropology, Columbia 82, Commissioned Space Service Military Wing 87, and now you're in trouble for the first time. How are you going to handle it, Jack? He asked himself. Can you prove that that silver eagle really belongs on your shoulder? He was sweating. He felt very tired. He shut his eyes for a moment, opened them, and said into the intercom, Send in the marks. 5 of them entered, made ceremonial bows, and ranged themselves nervously along the far wall as if they were firing squad candidates. Accompanying them came Steber of the linguistics team, hastily recalled from town to serve as an interpreter for Duval. The Colonel's knowledge of Markin was adequate, but sketchy. He wanted Steber around in case any fine points had to be dealt with in detail. The marks were humanoid in structure, simian in ancestry, which should have made them close kin to the Terrans in general physiological structure. They weren't. Their skin was a rough, coarse, pebble-grained affair, dark-toned, running to muddy browns and occasional deep purples. Their jaws had somehow acquired a reptilian hinge in the course of evolution, which left them practically chinless, but capable of swallowing food in huge lumps that would strangle an earthman. Their eyes, liquid gold in colour, were set wide on their heads, allowing enormous peripheral vision. Their noses were flat buttons, in some cases barely perceptible. Duval saw 2 younger men, obviously warriors. They had left their weapons outside, but their jaws jutted belligerently, and the darker of the pair had virtually dislocated his jaw in rage. The woman looked like all the Mark women, shapeless and weary behind her shabby cloak of furs. The remaining pair were priests, one old, one very old. It was this ancient to whom Duval addressed his first remarks. "I'm sorry that our meeting this afternoon has to be one of sorrow. I had been looking forward to a pleasant talk, but it's not always possible to predict what lies ahead." "Death lay ahead for him who was killed," the old priest said in the dry, high-pitched tone of voice that Duval knew implied anger and scorn. The woman let out a sudden wild ululation, half a dozen wailing words jammed together so rapidly Duval could not translate them. "What did she say?" he asked Steber. The interpreter flattened his palms together thoughtfully. "She's the woman of the man who was killed. She was demanding revenge," he said in English. Apparently, the two young warriors were friends of the dead man. Duval's eyes scanned the 5 hostile alien faces. "This is a highly regrettable incident," he said in Markin, "but I trust it won't affect the warm relationship between Earthmen and Markin that has prevailed so far. This misunderstanding—" "Blood must be atoned," said the smaller and less impressively garbed of the two priests. He was probably the local priest, Duval thought, and was probably happy to have his superior on hand to back him up. The colonel flicked sweat from his forehead. The young man who committed the act will certainly be disciplined. Of course you realize that a killing in self-defense cannot be regarded as murder, but I admit the young man did act unwisely and will suffer the consequences. It didn't sound too satisfying to Duval, and indeed the aliens hardly seemed impressed. The high priest uttered 2 short, sharp syllables. They were not words in Duval's vocabulary, and he looked over at Steber in appeal. "He said Leonard's was trespassing on sacred ground. He said the crime they're angry about is not murder, but blasphemy." Despite the heat, Duval felt a sudden chill. Not murder? This is going to be complicated, he realized gloomily. To the priest he said, "Does this change the essential nature of the case? He'll still be punished by us for his action, which can't be condoned." "You may punish him for murder, if you so choose," the high priest said, speaking very slowly so Duval could understand each word. The widow emitted some highly terrestrial-sounding sobs. The young man glowered stolidly. "Murder is not our concern," the high priest went on. "He has taken life. Life belongs to them, and they withdraw it whenever they see fit, by whatever means they care to employ. But he has also desecrated a sacred flower on sacred ground. These are serious crimes to us. Added to this, he has shed the blood of a guardian on sacred ground. We ask you to turn him over to us for trial by a priestly court on this double charge of blasphemy. Afterward, perhaps, you may try him by your own laws, for whichever one of them he has broken." For an instant all Duval saw was the old priest's implacable leathery face. Then he turned and caught the expression of white-faced astonishment and dismay Steber displayed. It took several seconds for the high priest's words to sink in, and several more before Duval came to stunned realization of the implications. They want to try an Earthman, he thought numbly, by their own law, in their own court, and mete out their own punishment. This had abruptly ceased being a mere local incident, an affair to clean up, note in the log, and forget. It was no longer a matter of simple reparations for the accidental killing of an alien. Now, thought Duval dully, it was a matter of galactic importance, and he was the man who had to make all the decisions. He visited Leonard's that evening, after the meal. By that time everyone in the camp knew what had happened, though Duval had ordered Steber to keep quiet about the alien demand to try Leonard's themselves. The boy looked up as Duval entered his room, and managed a soggy salute. At ease, Lieutenant. Duval sat on the edge of Leonard's bed and squinted up at him. Son, you're in very hot water now.
Sir, I
know. You didn't mean to pluck leaves off the sacred bramble bush, and you couldn't help shooting down the native who attacked you. And if this business were as simple as all that, I'd reprimand you for hot-headedness and let it go at that. But what, sir? Duval scowled and forced himself to face the boy squarely. But the aliens want to try you themselves. They aren't so much concerned with the murder as they are with your double act of blasphemy. That withered old high priest wants to take you before an ecclesiastical court. You won't allow that, of course, will you, Colonel? Leonard seemed confident that such an unthinkable thing could never happen. I'm not so sure, Paul, Duval said quietly, deliberately using the boy's first name.
What, sir?
This is evidently something very serious you've committed. That high priest is calling a priestly convocation to deal with you. They'll be back here to get you tomorrow at noon, he said.
But you wouldn't turn me over to them, sir. After all, I was on duty. I had no knowledge of the offence I was committing. Why, it's none of their business.
Make them see that, Duval said flatly. They're aliens. They don't understand Terran legal codes. They don't want to hear about our laws. By theirs, you've blasphemed, and blasphemers must be punished. This is a law-abiding race on Markin. They're an ethically advanced society, regardless of the fact that they're not technologically advanced. Ethically, they're on the same plane we are. Leonard's looked terribly pale.
You'll turn me over to them?
Duval shrugged. I didn't say that, but look at it from my position. I'm leader of a cultural and military mission. Our purpose is to live among these people, learn their ways, guide them as much as we can in our limited time here. We at least try to make a pretense of respecting their rights as individuals and as a species, you know. Well, now it's squarely on the line. Are we friends living among them and helping them, or are we overlords grinding them under our thumbs?
Sir, I'd say that was an oversimplification, Leonard remarked hesitantly.
Maybe so, but the issue's clear enough. If we turn them down, it means we're setting up a gulf of superiority between Earth and these aliens, despite the big show we made about being brothers. And word will spread to other planets. We try to sound like friends, but our actions in the celebrated Leonard's case reveal our true colours. We're arrogant, imperialistic, patronizing, and, well, do you see?
So you're going to turn me over to them for trial, then? The boy said quietly.
Duval shook his head. He felt old, very old, at 50. I don't know. I haven't made up my mind yet. If I turn you over, it'll certainly set a dangerous precedent, and if I don't, I'm not sure what will happen. He shrugged. I'm going to refer the case back to Earth. It isn't my decision to make. But it was his decision to make, he thought, as he left the boys' quarters and headed stiff-legged toward the communications shack. He was on the spot, and only he could judge the complex of factors that controlled the case. Earth would almost certainly pass the buck back to him. He was grateful for one thing, though. At least Leonard's hadn't made an appeal to him on family grounds. That was cause for pride, and some relief.
The fact that the boy was his nephew was something he'd have to blot rigorously from his mind until all this was over. The signalman was busy in the back of the shack, bent over a crowded work table. Duval waited a moment, cleared his throat gently, and said, "Mr. Rory?" Rory turned. "Yes, Colonel?" "Put through a sub-radio solido to Earth for me, immediately. To Director Thornton at the ET department. And yell for me when you've made contact." It took 20 minutes for the subspace impulse to leap out across the light years and find a receiver on Earth. 10 minutes more for it to pass through the relay point and on to Rio. Duval returned to the shack to find the lambent green solido field in tune and waiting for him. He stepped through and discovered himself standing a few feet before the desk of the ET department's head. Thornton's image was sharp, but the desk seemed to waver at the edges. Solid, non-organic objects always came through poorly. Quickly, Duval reviewed the situation. Thornton sat patiently, unmoving, till the end of it. Hands knotted rigidly, lean face set. He might have been a statue. Finally, he commented, "Unpleasant business." "Quite." "The alien is returning tomorrow, you say? I'm afraid that doesn't give us much time to hold a staff meeting and explore the problem, Colonel Duval." "I could probably delay him a few days." Thornton's thin lips formed a tight, bloodless line. After an instant he said, "No. Take whatever action you deem necessary, Colonel. If the psychological pattern of the race is such that unfortunate consequences would result if you refuse to allow them to try your man, then you must certainly turn him over. If the step can be avoided, of course, avoid it. The man must be punished in any case." The director smiled bleakly. "You're one of our best men, Colonel. I'm confident you'll arrive at an ultimately satisfactory resolution to this incident." "Thank you, sir," Duval said in a dry, uncertain voice. He nodded and stepped back out of the field range. Thornton's image seemed to flicker. Duval caught one last dismissing sentence. "Report back to me when the matter is settled." And then the field died. He stood alone in the shabby communications shack, blinking out the sudden darkness that rolled in over him after the solidophone's intense light, and after a moment began to pick his way over to the heaps of equipment and out into the compound. It was as he had expected. Thornton was a good man, but he was a civilian appointee, subject to government control. He disliked making top-level decisions, particularly when a colonel a few hundred light-years away could be pitchforked into making them for him. "Well," he thought, "at least I notified Earth. The rest of the affair is in my hands." Significantly, there was a red sunset again that night. He called a meeting of his top staff men for 09:15 the following morning. Work at the base had all but suspended. The linguistics team was confined to the area, and Duval had ordered guards posted at all exits. Violence could rise unexpectedly among even the most placid of alien peoples. It was impossible to predict the moment when a racial circuit breaker would cease to function and fierce hatred burst forth. They listened in silence to the tapes of Leonard's statements, Meyer's comments, and the brief interview Duval had had with the 5 aliens. Duval punched the cut-off stud and glanced rapidly round the table at his men. 2 majors, a captain, and a quartet of lieutenants comprised his high staff, and one of the lieutenants was confined to quarters. "That's the picture. The old high priest is showing up here about noon for my answer. I thought I'd toss the thing open for staff discussion first." Major Dudley asked for the floor. He was a short, stocky man with dark, flashing eyes, and on several occasions in the past had been known to disagree violently with Duval on matters of procedure. Duval had picked him for 4 successive trips, despite this. The Colonel believed in diversity of opinion, and Dudley was a tremendously efficient organizer as well. "Major?" "Sir, it doesn't seem to me that there's any question of what action to take. It's impossible to hand Leonards over to them for trial. It's unearth-like." Duvall frowned. "Would you elaborate, Major?" "Simple enough. We're the race who developed the space drive. Therefore, we're the galaxy's most advanced race. I think that goes without saying." "It does not," Duvall commented, "but go ahead." Scowling, Dudley said, "Regardless of your opinion, sir, the aliens we've encountered so far have all regarded us as obvious superiors. I don't think that can be denied, and I think it can only be attributed to the fact that we are their superiors. Well, if we give up Leonards for trial, it cheapens our position. It makes us look weak, spineless. You're suggesting, then," Duvall broke in, "that we hold the position of overlords in the galaxy, and by yielding to our serfs, we may lose all control over them. Is this your belief, Major?" Duvall glared at him. Dudley met the Colonel's angry gaze calmly. "Basically, yes, damn it, sir. I've tried to make you see this ever since the Hegath expedition. We're not out here in the stars to collect butterflies and squirrels. "Out of order," Duvall snapped coldly. "This is a cultural mission as well as military, Major, and so long as I'm in command, it remains primarily cultural." He felt on the verge of losing his temper. He glanced away from Dudley and said, "Major Grey, could I hear from you?" Grey was the ship's astrogator. On land, his functions were to supervise stockade construction and map-mating. He was a wiry, unsmiling little man with razor-like cheekbones and ruddy skin. "I feel we have to be cautious, sir. Handing Leonards over would result in a tremendous loss of Terran prestige." "Loss?" Dudley burst in. "It would cripple us! We'd never be able to hold our heads up honestly in the galaxy again if—" Calmly, Duvall said, "Major Dudley, you've been ruled out of order. Leave this meeting, Major. I'll discuss a downward revision of your status with you later." Turning back to Grey without a further glance at Dudley, he said, "You don't believe, Major, that such an action would have a corresponding favourable effect on our prestige in the eyes of these worlds inclined to regard Earth uneasily?" "That's an extremely difficult thing to determine, sir." "Very well, then." Duvall rose. "Pursuant to regulations, I brought this matter to the attention of authorities on Earth, and I've also offered it for open discussion among my officers. Thanks for your time, gentlemen." Captain Marichal said uncertainly, "Sir, won't there be any vote on our intended course of action?" Duvall grinned coldly. "As commanding officer of this base, I'll take the sole responsibility upon myself for the decision in this particular matter. It may make things easier for all of us in the consequent event of a court-martial inquiry." It was the only way, he thought, as he waited tensely in his office for the High Priest to arrive. The officers seemed firmly set against any conciliatory action in the name of Terra's prestige. It was hardly fair for him to make them take responsibility for a decision that might be repugnant to them. Too bad about Dudley, Duvall mused, but insubordination of that sort was insufferable. Dudley would have to be dropped from the unit on the next trip out. "If there is any next trip out for me," he added. The intercom glowed gently. "Yes?" "Alien delegation is here, sir," said the orderly. "Don't send them in until I signal." He strode to the window and looked out. The compound at first glance seemed full of aliens. Actually, there were only a dozen, he realized, but they were clad in full panoply, bright red and harsh green robes, carrying spears and ornamental swords. Half a dozen enlisted men were watching them nervously from a distance, their hands ready to fly to blasters instantly if necessary. He weighed the choices one last time. If he handed Leonards over, the temporary anger of the aliens would be appeased, but perhaps at a long-range cost to Earth's prestige. Duval had long regarded himself as an essentially weak man with a superb instinct for camouflage. But would his yielding to the aliens imply to the universe that all Earth was weak? On the other hand, he thought, suppose he refused to release Leonards to the aliens? Then he would be, in essence, bringing down the Overlord's thumb, letting the universe know that Earthmen were responsible only to themselves and not to the peoples, the worlds they visit. Either way, he realized, the standing of Earth in the galaxy's estimation would suffer. One way, they would look like appeasing weaklings, the other, like tyrants. He remembered a definition he had once read. Melodrama is the conflict of right and wrong. Tragedy is the conflict of right and right. Both sides were right here. Whichever way he turned, there would be difficulties. And there was an additional factor. The boy. What if they executed him? Family considerations seemed absurdly picayune at this moment, but still, to hand his own nephew over for possible execution by an alien people. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, sharpened the hard gaze of his eyes. A glance at the mirror over the bookcase told him he looked every inch the commanding officer. Not a hint of the inner conflict showed through. He depressed the intercom stud. Send in the high priest. Let the rest of them wait outside. The priest looked impossibly tiny and wrinkled, a gnome of a man whose skin was fantastically gullied and mazed by extreme age. He wore a green turban over his hairless head, a mark of deep mourning, Duval knew. The little alien bowed low, extending his pipe-stem arms behind his back at a sharp angle, indicating respect. When he straightened, his head craned back sharply, his small round eyes peering directly into Duval's. "The jury has been selected. The trial is ready to begin. Where is the boy?" Duval wished fleetingly he could have had the services of an interpreter for this last interview, but that was impossible. This was something he had to face alone, without help. "The accused man is in his quarters," Duval said slowly. "First, I want to ask some questions, old one." "Ask." "If I give you the boy to try, will there be any chance of his receiving the death penalty?" "It is conceivable." Duval scowled. "Can't you be a little more definite than that?" "How can we know the verdict before the trial takes place?" "Let that pass," Duval said, seeing he would get no concrete reply. "Where would you try him?" "Not far from here." "Could I be present at the trial?" "No." Duval had learned enough of Markan grammar by now to realize that the form of the negative the priest had employed meant literally, "I say no and mean what I say." Moistening his lips, he said, "Suppose I should refuse to turn Lieutenant Leonards over to you for trial. How could I expect you people to react?" There was a long silence. Finally the old priest said, "Would you do such a thing?" "I'm speaking hypothetically. Literally, the form was, I speak on a cloud." "It would be very bad. We would be unable to purify the sacred garden for many months. Also," he added a sentence of unfamiliar words. Duval puzzled unsuccessfully over their meaning for nearly a minute. "What does that mean?" he asked at length. "Phrase it in different words." "It is the name of a ritual. I would have to stand trial in the Earthman's place, and I would die," the priest said simply. then my successor would ask you all to go away." The office seemed very quiet. The only sounds Duval heard were the harsh breathing of the old priest and the off-key chirruping of the cricket-like insects that infested the grass plot outside the window. Appeasement, he wondered, or the Overlord's thumb. Suddenly there seemed no doubt at all in his mind of what he should do, and he wondered how he could have hesitated. "I hear and respect your wishes, old man," he said, in a ritual formula of renunciation Steber had taught him. "The boy is yours, but can I ask a favour?" "Ask." "He didn't know he was offending your laws. He meant well. He is sincerely sorry for what he did. He's in your hands now, but I want to ask mercy on his behalf. He had no way of knowing he was offending." "This will be seen at the trial," the old priest said coldly. "If there is to be mercy, mercy will be shown him. I make no promises." "Very well," Duval said. He reached for a pad and scrawled an order demanding Lieutenant Paul Leonards to the aliens for trial, and signed it with his full name and title. "Here, give this to the Earthman who let you in. He'll see to it that the boy is turned over to you." "You are wise," the priest said. He bowed elaborately and made for the door. "Just one moment," Duval said desperately as the alien opened the door. "Another question." "Ask," the priest said. "You told me you'd take his place if I refused to let you have him. Well, how about another substitute? Suppose—" "You are not acceptable to us," the priest said, as if reading Duval's mind, and left. 5 minutes later, the colonel glanced out his window and saw the solemn procession of aliens passing through the exit posts and out of the compound. In their midst, unprotesting, was Leonards. He didn't look back, and Duval was glad of it. The colonel stared at the row of books a long time. The frayed spools that had followed him around from world to world, from grey Danelon to stormy Lurin to bone-dry Corval, and on to Hegath and Mqualt and the others, and now to warm blue-skied Markin. Shaking his head, he turned away and dropped heavily into the foam cradle behind his desk. He snapped on the autotype with a savage gesture and dictated a full account of his actions, from the very start until his climactic decision, and smiled bitterly. There would be a certain time lag, but before long the autotype facsimile machine in the ET department's basement would start clacking there in Rio, and Thornton would know what Duval had done. And Thornton would be stuck with it as department policy henceforth. Duval switched on the intercom and said, "I'm not to be disturbed under any circumstances. If there's anything urgent, have it sent to Major Gray. He's acting head of the base until I countermand. And if any messages come from Earth, let Gray have them too." He wondered if they'd relieve him of his command immediately, or wait until he got back to Earth. The latter more likely. Thornton had some subtlety, if not much. But there was certain to be an inquiry, and a head would roll. Duval shrugged and stretched back. "I did what was right," he told himself firmly. "That's the one thing I can be sure of. But I hope I don't ever have to face my sister again." He dozed after a while, eyes half open and slipping rapidly closed. Sleep came to him, and he welcomed it, for he was terribly tired. He was awakened suddenly by a loud outcry, a jubilant shout from a dozen throats at once, splitting the afternoon calm. Duval felt a moment's disorientation, then, awakening rapidly, he sprang to the window and peered out. A figure, alone and on foot, was coming through the open gateway. He wore regulation uniform, but it was dripping wet and torn in several places. His blonde hair was plastered to his scalp as if he had been swimming. He looked fatigued. Leonard's. The colonel was nearly halfway out the front door before he realized that his uniform was in improper order. He forced himself back, tidied his clothing, and with steely dignity strode out the door a second time. Leonard stood surrounded by a smiling knot of men, enlisted men and officers alike. The boy was grinning wearily. "Attention!" Duval barked, and immediately the area fell silent. He stepped forward. Leonard raised one arm in an exhausted salute. There were some ugly bruises on him. "I'm back, Colonel." "I'm aware of that. You understand I'll have to return you to the marks for trial anyway, despite your no doubt daring escape?" The boy smiled and shook his head. "No, sir, you don't follow, sir. The trial's over. I've been tried and acquitted." "What's that?" "It was trial by ordeal, Colonel. They prayed for half an hour or so, and then they dumped me in the lake down the road. The dead man's 2 brothers came after me and tried to drown me, but I outswam them and came up safely on the other side." He shook his hair like a drenched cat, scattering a spray of water several feet in the air. "They nearly had me once, but as soon as I got across the lake alive and undrowned, it proved to them that I couldn't have meant any harm. So they declared me innocent, apologized, and turned me loose. They were still praying when I left them." There seemed to be no bitterness in Leonard's attitude. Apparently, Duval thought, he had understood the reason for the decision to hand him over, and would not hold it against him now. That was gratifying. "You'd better get to your quarters and dry off, Lieutenant, and then come to my office. I'd like to talk to you there." "Yes, sir." Duval spun sharply and headed back across the clearing to his office. He slammed the door behind him and switched on the autotype. The report to Earth would have to be amended now. A moment or two after he had finished, the intercom glowed. He turned it on and heard Steber's voice saying, "Sir, the old priest is here. He wants to apologize to you for everything. He's wearing clothing of celebration, and he brought a peace offering for us." "Tell him I'll be right out," Duval said, "and call all the men together, including Dudley, especially Dudley. I want him to see this." He slipped off his sweat-stained jacket and took a new one out. Surveying himself in the mirror, he nodded approvingly. "Well, well," he thought, "so the boy came through it safely. That's good." But he knew that the fate of Paul Leonard's had been irrelevant all along, except on the sheerly personal level. It was the larger issue that counted. For the first time, Earth had made a concrete demonstration of the equality of intelligent life doctrine it had been preaching so long. He had shown that he respected the Markan laws in terms of what they were to the marks, and he had won the affection of a race as a result. Having the boy return unharmed was a bonus. But the precedent had been set, and the next time, perhaps, on some other world, the outcome might not be so pleasant. Some cultures had pretty nasty ways of putting criminals to death. He realized that the burden the Earth exploration teams carried now had become many times heavier, that now Earthmen would be subject to the laws of the planets who hosted them, and no more unwitting botanical excursions into sacred gardens could be tolerated. But it was for the ultimate good, he thought. We've shown them that we're not overlords, and that most of us don't want to be overlords. And now the thumb comes down on us. He opened the door and stepped out. The men had gathered, and the old priest knelt abjectly at the foot of the steps, bearing some sort of enamelled box as his offering. Duval smiled and returned the bow, and lifted the old alien gently to his feet. "We'll have to be on our best behaviour from now on," he thought. "We'll really have to watch our steps, but it'll be worth it."
The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story.
The Way Out by Richard Rein Smith. Originally published in Infinity, June 1958. Narrated by Tom Trissel. The room was a maze of mirrors that reflected his nightmare image. At first he had tried to close his eyes, but found that they had done something to them. He could not close them, and was forced to look at the thing in the hundreds of mirrors, seeing it from all angles. He had tried to sleep, thinking that, if asleep, he would not see the mirrors and himself. But they had injected drugs into his body, drugs that made sleep impossible, except when they wanted him to sleep. A human body had to have a minimum of sleep. They knew what that minimum was, and gave it to him when they wanted him to have it. But even sleep was no release. During those first days, he discovered that a man unable to close his eyes will see while he sleeps. And in every dream, the mirrors and the nightmare were there, superimposed upon the dream as two negatives placed one upon another. If he dreamed that he was a child again, playing in the fields and chasing rabbits, the nightmare image was there, superimposed upon the dream. If he dreamed that he was a teenager, walking Betty home from the movies and holding her soft hand in his, it was there, hovering in the air around them. No matter what he dreamed, it was there. He found that there was one relief from the nightmare, and only one. They had left his right arm intact. In the event, he thought, that I give in, I will be able to write the answers they want to know. But that was not a complete relief. To stare at the smoothness and perfection of flesh in his right arm for long periods was to admit that the rest of his body was. They were clever with pain, he thought. Pain, he had realized during those first days, was a monumental thing to a man. Pain was the first sensation experienced by a man, the slap of the doctor's hand, and the first breath of air in lungs unaccustomed to breathing. And pain was the very last sensation that a man experienced, the pain of death. Crowded in between those two sensations that represented a person's lifespan, pain was a dominant impetus. What drove a man to do anything except the impetus of pain, and the instinct to avoid pain? A man did a million things to avoid physical pain. To avoid hunger pains, a man would eat. To avoid the pain of coldness, a man would light a fire. To avoid aching muscles, a man would make a wheel to carry his burden. To lessen that burden, a man would split an atom. And a man did a million other things to avoid emotional pain. To avoid the pain of loneliness, a man would make friends. To avoid the pain of boredom, a man would play a game. To avoid the pain of ugliness, a man would create beauty. Not an unpleasant reality, he realized. Not unpleasant because it was necessary. Nothing in the universe moved unless a force pushed or pulled it. A man unable to sense physical or emotional pain would do nothing. There would be nothing to push him. As wind moved clouds, pain moved man. The sight of his body was not exactly painful to him. They had not disfigured him. They had only changed him. To disassociate him from his body, no doubt. What they had done to him many would call an atrocity, he realized. But in a war, every time one soldier killed another, it was an atrocity. One man had taken the life of another. They had a job to do, and they were doing it. Successfully, he knew. When they came the next time, he would tell them what they wanted to know. Want to know where Fort Meade is located on Earth? Give me a map and I'll show you. How many soldiers do we have in the mountain range 100 miles from here? I'll give you my best estimate. I'll tell you anything you want. Pain was the impetus to push a man, he knew. They had pushed him and pushed him, doing their job, and they had pushed him far enough. A man was not linked to other men and his nation and his world by tangible threads. A man was separate and distinct. A man's body was a world in itself. He had been pushed into his world by pain. Somewhere, beyond the wall of pain that came or vanished when they wanted, somewhere he had friends, an army, a world called Earth. But they didn't matter. His world mattered. And oddly, he wasn't afraid of pain anymore. It was just a thing to be avoided in any way. And he wasn't to be pitied. They had changed him. Sergeant Chester Gregg wasn't a man anymore. He was something that could be added to and subtracted from, a pliable thing that could be prodded and moulded, an object that could be pushed this way and that way. Murphy raised his head. He could tell from the flashes of artillery fire that they were surrounded. Ontarian artillery had a purplish flash of light that their own guns did not have, and he could see, in every direction, there was an occasional flash of purplish light. The flashes formed a circle around them. He lowered himself into the foxhole. "What?" Hank inquired. "Surrounded." "Are you sure?" Hank crouched in the semi-darkness as if about to pounce on something. "Damn it, if you don't believe me, take a look." Hank hesitated. He was a tall, lanky person with red hair and boyish freckles. He had an awkward, self-conscious manner, and despite his powerful body, the freckles and manner made others think of him as a boy rather than a man. He was 18, and combat had hardened his muscles without hardening his appearance. "I believe you," he said. "Do you think we'll get out?" "Hard to tell. Maybe." Murphy leaned back and looked up at the dark sky. It was filled with stars, stars that twinkled, and intermingled with them were other points of light that were not stars. They were atomic explosions, and unlike the stars, they did not twinkle. An atomic explosion in outer space, without the pressure of atmosphere, expanded tremendously. When it reached the limit of expansion, it faded, and watching a battle in outer space was like watching a maze of tiny blinking lights. Murphy watched those tiny blips of light every night. One night, if he lived long enough, there would be no blips of light, and that would mean that one side was beaten. They were fighting and dying on Antares, but the battle was a secondary one. It was the battle in outer space that would win the war. If the Antarians won that battle, then every Earthman on Antares would die, because there would be no more supplies. If Earth won that battle, the Antarians would be beaten, since they would have no way to stop Earth from sending more men and more supplies. He closed his eyes and tried to concentrate on the problem of saving Hank's life. That was his habit. Every time he went into combat, he picked someone like Hank, a kid, and stuck with him. He would worry about that kid, whoever he might be, and try to keep him out of tight spots. It was his way of protecting himself. Whenever he worried about his own life, his mind always froze. But worrying about someone else was different. "I think I'd rather die than be captured," Hank said. "I heard they have ways of making a guy talk, ways of making a guy tell them anything." Murphy nodded his head in agreement. It would be better to die than be captured. The war with the Antarians was different from the world wars on Earth. Antarians were aliens and resembled lizards more than men. There was no way for them to disguise themselves effectively, and they had no agents on Earth to learn the location of factories and military installations. From 1,000 miles in space, if one of their ships were fast enough, they could photograph Earth's surface. Closer than 1,000 miles, rockets from Earth's interceptor system would destroy a ship. Atomic rockets dropped from Antarian ships could zigzag through Earth's atmosphere at tremendous speeds, and 50% got through the interceptor system. But a ship containing enough fuel to take it from Antares to Earth and back was large and unmaneuverable, and venturing closer than 1,000 miles was fatal. And a photograph taken from 1,000 miles does not show factories and military installations. Through magnification, the photograph will show rivers, mountain ranges, land masses, and varicolored patches of land that could be cities or anything. So the Antarians had been forced to hurl atomic bombs aimlessly. Those that got through the defensive system usually struck deserted areas. The Antarians had only one choice: capture as many soldiers as possible and make them tell where military targets were located. And to them, men were an alien form of life. Their science was not adapted to the human body. They had no drugs to affect the human mind. In the middle of an interplanetary war, they could not spare the workers time, wealth, and effort to invent drugs that had taken mankind itself years to produce. But it took them only a few minutes to make a whip. As Murphy listened, the distant rumble of exploding shells grew in volume. They were walking shells across the surrounded area. He flattened himself against the bottom of the foxhole and covered his ears with his hands. Even through his hands the roar of explosions was deafening, and he felt the ground shake while shell fragments whistled through the air above. That was Antarian tactics, he remembered. Whenever possible, they surrounded an area, pounded it until there were only a few men left, and then charged with their infantry, taking as many prisoners as possible. The roar of exploding shells diminished in volume as the barrage moved farther away. Silence. Murphy checked his rifle and rose. He looked across a desolate terrain covered with craters and smouldering shell fragments. The forest near them, that weird forest of 100-foot trees with green trunks and yellow leaves, was almost gone. The barrage had left only a few trees upright, trees with their branches torn from them, trees that looked like shadowy fingers pointing at the stars. "I suppose they'll be coming now," Hank said. "Any minute. They always follow a barrage." "I won't surrender," Hank said as he checked his rifle. "I know that. There wouldn't be anything to gain." "You couldn't surrender if you wanted to." "Huh?" "The army doesn't allow it. You see, the army tells you what to do, how to do it, when to do it, and where to do it. There's regulations in the manuals to cover everything. If there aren't regulations about something, that's because the army doesn't allow it. There are no regulations about how to surrender. That means you can't surrender." "Suppose you haven't got anything to fight with?" "No dice. If you only got one bullet, you fire that bullet. Then you use your bayonet. If your bayonet breaks, then you pick up rocks and throw them, and if there aren't any rocks around, then you attack with your bare hands. In other words, you keep fighting until you kill them or they kill you. If you surrender, you're a traitor." Hank was silent for a while. "If that's so," he said, "why do they have regulations about what to do after you're captured? You know that, give only your name, rank, and serial number stuff." "That," explained Murphy with mock impatience, "is for those cases when a guy might be captured while unconscious. The army's sensible. It knows you can't fight if you've been knocked unconscious by something." "Did you hear the rumor," Hank went on, "that every guy going into combat has something done to him, so he'll kill himself if he's captured? Hypnotism or something?" "Uh-huh." Murphy wished Hank hadn't mentioned that. He remembered, there at Fort Hendricks, Something strange had happened. Take a battalion of men, line them up outside a hospital, one by one. As the men enter a room, give them an injection that knocks them cold. Keep them unconscious for days while you feed them through the veins, and then revive them, put them in a formation, and march them back to their barracks without an explanation. Do something like that, and you'll cause all sorts of rumours. Those men will wonder what happened to them while they were unconscious. The more they wonder, the more fantastic the rumours will get. I doubt it, Murphy said. They had been whispering. No enemy followed a barrage so close that they were killed by their own shells, and Antarians could only move at a certain speed. That always left, immediately after a barrage, a few minutes during which they could talk or whisper in safety. But that time was limited, and they fell silent now. Murphy thought, somewhere out there, lizard-like things are crawling toward us. Any minute now, they'll be close enough to hear us if we make a sound, and they'll be waiting, hoping to hear a sound. They'll be holding their weapons with their tentacles as they move closer. They should be in a zoo where you could see them on Sunday afternoons and laugh. They're funny looking, but it's hard to laugh at them while they're trying to kill you. A rumble of sound. Murphy swung his rifle, aiming through the sights. It was a tank. They had no hand grenades, and it was impossible to knock one out with a rifle. But he reminded himself, he had explained to Hank, it was a soldier's job to fight, even if rocks if necessary. No, it was one of their tanks. Let's go, maybe they'll give us a ride. They climbed out of the foxhole. Murphy ran toward the tank, raising his arms above his head. Not a gesture of surrender, but a means of recognition. Antarians could walk on their hind legs, but their physiology did not allow them to raise their forelegs above their heads as men could. At night, when nothing could be seen clearly, it was the most effective password. The tank stopped. A voice came at them through the darkness. "What the hell do you want?" "Got room for 2 more?" Murphy inquired. "Give us a ride out. We're low on ammunition." A moment's hesitation, then, "Get in." Climbing into the tank was like climbing into a dark well. When the lid closed behind them, there was no light. The darkness annoyed Murphy, but he realized it was necessary. There were no slits for the crew to see through. Slits allowed bullets, radiation, and poison gas to enter a tank. The crew observed through periscopes that fitted tight against their faces. They were trained to work in the dark. It was a long, rough ride through the night. Murphy listened to the crew members, the roar of the motor. Now and then there was a sharp bark of the tank's cannon, and even through 4 inches of steel and lead he heard the roar of shock waves from distant atomic explosions. Hank whispered, "That wasn't right, was it? I mean, leaving like that and—" "Ever hear of strategic withdrawal?" Murphy asked. "We'll live to fight another day." Murphy slept at times. One time, after being awakened by a nearby explosion, one of the tank crew asked him his name and what unit he was with. He said he would radio their unit and ask if their CO had orders for them. Murphy gave his name and unit, then fell asleep again. Sometime during the night he felt a hand shaking him. "You lucky stiffs," a voice in the darkness said. "Your CO says you're to return to Earth on the next ship." Colonel Donovan climbed out of the jeep and walked a distance. He was a tall, husky man with powerful shoulders and prematurely grey hair. His face was hard and weather-beaten, and his eyes held the only hint of his intelligence. He did not have the delicate features and slender fingers of an intellectual, but his grey eyes were cold and alert. He had climbed to the rank of colonel partly by his physical strength and partly by that deceptive intelligence. He had an aggressive way of tackling a problem, a way of prodding it and beating it with its mind as if it were a physical thing, and he were beating it with his fists. During his career, he had solved numerous problems with his different approach. The intellectuals, the men who solved problems, had minds as alike as if they had been cut from the same pattern. A definite type of physique produced a definite mentality type, and a definite mentality type produced a definite way of thinking. The intellectuals were similar in body and mind, and their answers were often too similar. When the UN wanted a different answer, it called upon men such as Donovan. And Donovan had a new problem. He lit a cigarette without looking away from the ruins of Fort Meade. He could see at a glance that it had been a direct hit. Every building had been levelled, the ground scorched and fused into weird glass-like substances. There had been no burial details. Of all the thousands of soldiers at the fort, there had been no remains to bury. He had no special purpose in viewing the ruins, except to goad his mind. Reports on his desk in the new Pentagon had informed him of the facts. 7 military bases such as Fort Meade had been bombed by the Ontarians, all direct hits. It meant one of two things. 1. The Ontarians could take a photograph of Earth from 1,000 miles and spot military installations on that photograph. 2. They had tortured prisoners and learned the locations. Number 1 was improbable. Number 2 was very probable. He wondered, how do you prevent a man from giving information? It was an important problem. There seemed to be no way to prevent the Ontarians from taking prisoners, no way to prevent them from torturing prisoners. If they captured enough prisoners, they could learn the location of every military base and war plant on Earth. Every soldier knew the location of something vital. Almost every soldier could point to it on an aerial map. It was a simple matter of spotting rivers and mountain ranges and judging distances. The possibilities of preventing their men from talking were few, he realized. There was the standard answer: give a pill to every soldier and tell him to swallow the pill if he's captured. But that was the wrong answer. It had been used before, but only in the case of espionage agents. Used on an army of men, it would have a demoralizing effect. It would imply that you expected them to be captured. And what percentage of men would commit suicide? Besides that, the news would sooner or later leak out to the civilian population and have a demoralizing effect upon them. How would millions of mothers and wives feel if they knew their sons and husbands had been ordered to kill themselves if captured? No, suicide pills were not the answer. It had to be something different, something original, and as foolproof as anything could be. Preferably a way to kill a captured soldier, a way that the soldier was not aware of. Death seemed the only solution. Any man, tortured hard enough and long enough, would talk. How could you keep that man from talking except by killing him? And still, it wasn't right to kill your own men. How, he thought, can you kill a man without killing him? Hank was pacing the floor. We're on our way, Mirth. Back to Earth. No more combat. We'll train other guys how to fight. Instructors. What a deal. Weekend passes, girls, beer, fried chicken, real milk. Lay off, Murphy said. We aren't there yet. Sitting there on the edge of the cot, he struggled for a sense of reality. Nothing seemed real. Nothing had seemed real since they left the foxhole. There everything had seemed real. The coldness and wetness of the mud beneath them, the stars in the sky above them, 1,000 other things. But in the tank there had been nothing but darkness and voices in the darkness. The tank had broken through the Ontarian lines and taken them directly to a spaceport. There, in a thick fog, so thick that you could see only a few feet in any direction, they had boarded the ship. In the darkened ship, they had been led to this compartment. They had seen only 2 men aboard the ship. one crew member, seen at a distance, and Greg, the ship's captain. Now they were in outer space in a small compartment aboard a huge ship. It didn't seem real, and it felt as if they were walking through a shadowy dream. The door opened, and Captain Chester Gregg stepped into the room. Gregg, Murphy reflected, looked as if he had been taken apart and put together again. There were lines in his face, not lines that came from facial muscles, but the clean-cut lines of a surgeon's scalpel, lines that divided his face into small sections, and the flesh from his forehead to his chin did not change shade gradually. Each section was a slightly different shade than the section next to it. Not a hideous effect, but noticeable when you looked at him closely. Greg was evidently conscious of his appearance, for he stayed in the shadows as much as possible. Greg glanced around the room and grinned. "How do you like your quarters? Fancy, huh?" "Great," Murphy said. "Almost as good as the Ritz. Are we the only passengers?" Greg nodded his head affirmatively. "We had to leave in a hurry. We were scheduled to take more men back, but the Antarians were about to take over that port. We were lucky to get out when we did." Greg hesitated, then went on. "You guys are going to have a tough job when you get back. Not as easy as you might think. I know. I was in the infantry for a while, in a training outfit. Hard work." He placed some papers on the table. "Here's your homework." "Homework?" Hank repeated. "It's the newest thing," Greg explained. "They figure that men who've been in combat with the Antarians can train recruits better than men back on Earth who've never even seen the Antarians. The plan is to train men like yourselves on the way back to Earth. No time wasted. That is, they plan to teach you how to train others. We have a colonel and a couple lieutenants aboard. You fill out those papers, and they'll judge your knowledge of military procedure. Then they'll know exactly how much they'll have to teach you." When Greg left, Murphy examined the papers. As Greg said, the papers were a test of their knowledge of military procedure. There were yes and no questions. Questions such as, describe procedure to infiltrate enemy lines. Describe procedure for establishing night patrols. Describe alternate code system. Hundreds of questions. And an aerial map. The question, give the approximate location of Fort Johnson. And in small print at the bottom, the notation that this was a test of memory and ability to judge distance. "Look at this, Hank." Hank studied the map and question. "That's easy," he said. "I was stationed at Fort Johnson. There's Salt Lake, see? Fort Johnson is about—" "I said look, not talk." Murphy rose and glared at Hank. "You're stupid," he added. "What's the matter with you?" Hank inquired, his jaw sagging. "You're stupid," Murphy repeated. "Don't you ever question anything? This whole thing smells fishy." He paced the floor, glaring at the metal walls. There was something wrong with the compartment. It was like any compartment aboard any ship, but there was something wrong. He knew there was something wrong, but he couldn't pinpoint it. "It doesn't make sense. We were in a foxhole a few hours ago, and now we're on a ship headed for Earth. It doesn't make sense." "We're going to be instructors." "And that map is fishy," Murphy continued. "That's the sort of thing the Ontarians would want to know. They have to photograph Earth from 1,000 miles out. They'd like to know exactly where Fort Johnson is." "Well, so what?" "So what? Hasn't it occurred to you that maybe we're prisoners of the Ontarians?" "Are you serious?" Hank inquired. "How can we be prisoners?" He glanced around the room and shrugged his shoulders. "We were picked up by one of our own tanks and—" "The Ontarians capture our tanks now and then. It could have been a trick." "Our own men were aboard the tank." "We didn't see them. It was too dark inside the tank to see anything." "We heard them," Hank insisted. "That doesn't mean anything." Murphy remembered that they had been warned about Ontarian talkie machines. The Entarians frequently tricked or forced a prisoner to talk for hours. The conversation was recorded, broken down according to individual sounds, and recorded in a talking machine. The machine resembled a typewriter, and an Ontarian could reproduce any vocal sound by pressing one of its keys. A skilled Ontarian linguist could use one of these machines and carry on a conversation with perfect English. They had been used during attempts to infiltrate their lines at night, but, Murphy realized, one could have been used in the tank. "Take it easy," Hank said. "You're imagining things. We're on one of our own ships." "Are we? What have we seen of this ship except the corridor and this compartment? It could be... well, this compartment could be like a stage. It was so foggy outside we couldn't see anything." He paused to light a cigarette and continued. "Greg gave me the idea. I've seen Greg before, at Fort Meade. I remember him, but he doesn't remember me. Of course, that's natural. You meet a lot of guys in the army, and you can't remember them all. But Greg was in the infantry, like he said, and now he's a ship's captain. Our army doesn't work like that. The infantry doesn't take a man and train him to be a spaceship captain. That's the sort of thing the Ontarians would do. They have a screwy theory about their soldiers being versatile." Hank's eyebrows rose. There was a trace of doubt on his face. "We're here," he said nervously. "We can hear the ship's engines." Murphy listened. True, they could hear a ship's engines. "Could be a recording," he said. "If there's a possibility, maybe we shouldn't talk so damned much." Hank rose to his feet, frowning. "If you're right, they may have hidden microphones." "What's the difference?" If they were prisoners, Murphy thought, there was no reason to keep the Ontarians from knowing that they knew. There would be no chance to escape, no way out. Ontarians took their prisoners far behind their lines. A man, a creature who walked upright on two legs, could not disguise himself and pass unnoticed among creatures that resembled lizards and crawled on four legs. No, if they were prisoners, they would be well behind the lines. There would be no way to escape. But, he wondered, if we're prisoners, why are they trying to keep us from realizing it? They had used a trick to get information, but they could have gotten the same information through torture. He knew. He was brave enough to die for his country, but not strong enough to... What's wrong with this compartment? He interrupted the chain of thought. There was something wrong with the compartment. He could sense the wrongness. But what could be wrong with cots, a table, four walls, a ceiling, and a floor? There was nothing wrong with them. So that meant there was something wrong that was not in the compartment. A something that came into the compartment from outside. What, he thought wildly, is not in here, but comes in here from outside? I've got it! Hank jumped, startled. What? Vibrations, Murphy said. There aren't any. Hank shrugged his shoulders. It's important, Murphy said. Remember the troop ship that took us to Antares? I remember I had trouble sleeping because of the vibrations. Every ship has vibrations. The engines kick up one hell of a fuss and the vibrations travel all over the ship. Not so bad in some places, but you can feel them anywhere. He pressed his hands against a wall. Hank, some of the colour draining from his face, did the same. See, Murphy inquired, there are no vibrations. We're supposed to be in outer space headed for Earth. There should be vibrations. He hit the wall with his fist. He hit it harder. The wall didn't sound right. Taking his bayonet, he jabbed the wall. The blade cut through a thin layer of metal. A layer of metal no thicker than 1/16 of an inch. Laughing wildly, he cut a large rectangle. The section clattered to the floor, exposing a layer of wood. He kicked at the wood, dry, crumbling wood that gave way beneath his foot. He climbed through the opening. Hank followed him. Colonel Donovan studied the papers before him with blank eyes. Lately the project had started to annoy his conscience. and the fact that it was a logical move did not lessen the annoyance. There at Fort Meade he had faced the problem. How can you keep men from giving information when captured? It had been a vital problem. Without a solution, the Ontarians could have learned countless military secrets and ultimately won the war. Death had seemed the only solution, but it had not seemed right to deliberately murder their own men. He had asked himself, how can you kill a man without killing him? And he had come up with the answer. Drive him insane. They had placed him in charge of the project, and he had organized a group of psychologists, psychiatrists, chemists, doctors, and sociologists. He had asked them, can you install the seeds of schizophrenia in a soldier? Seeds that will bloom upon the realization that he is a prisoner of the enemy, and only upon that realization. The answer had been, maybe, and they had started on the project. The system had been developed after months of research and experiment. It worked through a combination of surgery, hypnosis, psychiatric, encephalographic, and chemical treatment, all given to a soldier while under drugs and hypnosis. Although the originator of the system, no one had told him exactly how it worked. In such matters, it was the Army's policy not to tell anyone who did not have to know, and, not being a scientist, he would not have understood all the mechanics if explained to him. But he had a vague concept. A soldier realizes that he is a prisoner of the enemy, and the realization triggers a reaction planted in his mind. A reaction placed there by surgery, hypnosis, psychiatric, encephalographic, and chemical treatment. The reaction forced the soldier into a schizophrenic dream, entirely separated from the world, a tight, permanent dream dissociated from all sensory perception, a dream that not even Ontarian whips could reach. And it annoyed his conscience. He was responsible for the insanity of thousands of their men. He could not help feeling that perhaps, if he had tried harder, he could have thought of another way. The door opened, and Phillips burst into the room in his customary manner. He threw some papers on Donovan's desk. "Our new project," he said. "A tough one. Impossible, I should say." While Donovan glanced at the papers, Phillips slumped in a chair and lit a cigarette. "The Ontarians have made a counter-move," he explained. "We found a way to prevent them from torturing prisoners and getting information, but our system depends upon the realization by a soldier that he is a prisoner. The Ontarians learned that, and now they have a new approach. They use our tanks that they've captured and pretend to be our troops while they trick information from our men. You see, our men have the treatment, but they don't realize they're prisoners, so the treatment doesn't work. Our new project is to find a way that our men will realize they're prisoners despite any trickery." He shrugged his shoulders as if the problem were a tangible thing and he wished to thrust it aside. "Anyway, the war is almost over and the Ontarians are losing. I don't think it'll make any difference whether we find a solution or not. The war will probably be over before—" He hesitated when he noticed Donovan's expression. "What's the matter?" he inquired. "You look sick." "Nothing." Phillips nodded his head. "I get it. The same old stuff. Your conscience is bothering you again." He leaned back in the chair, placed his hands behind his head, and looked up at the ceiling. "You're foolish to let it bother you. You know what happened to me yesterday? On the way home, I had a flat tire. It was raining, muddy as all hell, and I messed up my last clean uniform. The tire was ruined. Now I haven't got a spare and can't buy one because of this damned war. My wife's sister, Louise, is staying with us now. Her husband was killed on Antares, and she cries all night, every night. Now and then she gets Martha crying. Last night I couldn't stand it, so I went out and had a few drinks. I got charged with drunken driving, and when I got home this morning I really caught it. Martha's talking about getting a divorce. She says Donovan groaned. "Phil, I'm interested in your problems. Some day we'll sit down together and cry on each other's shoulder, but—" Phillips raised a hand. I was trying to illustrate how we all have 100 big and little troubles every day. The fact that the system prevented thousands of men from being tortured does not matter to you. Your stupid conscience hurts because you're responsible for driving men insane. But you don't understand. It's not a simple case of schizophrenia that our men get. It's a schizophrenic dream. The system blocks all sensory contacts and speeds up the mind. You know how a person dreams only a few seconds before he wakes up, and that dream seems days or weeks long? Can you imagine how much a dream can be speeded up and clarified by drugs? How much a dream can be controlled by hypnotic suggestion? How much experience can be... Murphy saw that they were on a street, the tall angular shadows of strange buildings all around them. He heard a shuffling noise and turned to see Ontarians crawling toward them. They were prisoners. For some reason, the Ontarians had kept them from realizing it, and... A brief, intense pain ripped through his skull. He closed his eyes for a few seconds, then opened them. The Ontarians were dead, their bodies riddled with bullets. There at the end of the street, their troops. He looked up at the sky. There were no blinking pinpoints of light among the stars. The war was over. They had won. The years that followed were good ones for Murphy. Although he had never written a line before, he wrote a novel about his war experiences and became a bestseller. He went to Hollywood when a motion picture producer purchased the story and, unbelievably, became an actor. He had never considered himself a handsome man, but millions of viewers considered him handsome, and beautiful women were attracted to him. He married and became the father of 2 children. Life seemed like a dream, a perfect dream in which, day after day, year after year, everything was perfect.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story.
Weapon by J.F. Bone. Originally published in Amazing Stories, June 1961. Narrated by Tom Trussell. Bright chatter flowed around her, filling the clean-conditioned air of the room with inconsequential noise that hid the tension in a froth of words. It was what wasn't being said that was important. Ellen Fisk thought as she listened to the high-pitched voices. Of course, one never paraded feelings. It was indecent, something like undressing in public. But this matter of keeping a stiff upper lip could be carried to extremes. You went to these get-togethers, played cards, and talked about dresses and children and grocery bills just as though there was no war, as though the Eglani never existed, as though the men in the Navy would come back as regularly and predictably as they did from commercial runs in the old days. But try as you did, you couldn't keep the undercurrents hidden. Fear clung to the sharp shards of sound. There was longing, grief, resignation, and hope, all mixed with a firm, unreasoning conviction that if one buried her feelings deep enough, everything would solve itself and wind up with a happy ending. Her hands tightened convulsively, and cards squirted from her fingers to the floor as the high-pitched, keening shriek of a spaceship's jets came to her ears. The talk stopped suddenly as every woman in the room paused to listen, and every eye turned involuntarily toward the ceiling. A big one was coming in. The entire house shivered, quivering in resonant sympathy to the throbbing pulse of the spaceship's drives. The sound swelled to a crescendo, to stop abruptly with a sharp finality that left an aching silence in its wake. "I'm sorry, Anne," Ellen said, as she bent to retrieve the cards scattered on the floor. "For a moment I couldn't help thinking that—" She stopped and blushed. "Don't apologize," Anne Albertson said. "I know how you feel. Fact is, I've felt that way myself, more than once." Her eyes were grey and wise in the frame of her pointed elfin face. Ellen felt a rush of gratitude. Anne was understanding beyond her years, little Anne with her piercing giggle and gay smile. Anne with a husband already a week overdue. She didn't allow herself the luxury of worry, Ellen thought enviously, but then she had been married nearly 4 years now. She was a veteran of 1,000 nights of waiting, not a bride of 4 months who had only seen her husband twice since that utterly mad and beautiful honeymoon, that precious 2 weeks torn from a reluctant navy. It wasn't easy to be a navy wife, to listen to the shriek of jet blasts that lowered ships to earth or sent them hurtling outward into the void. It wasn't easy to constantly wonder with each incoming craft, is it his ship? Has he come home safely once more? Or as the weeks passed, to feel the question turn to a prayer, please God, make this one his, make it his. This one wasn't Alton's ship. It couldn't be. He wasn't due back from patrol for another week, and until that week had passed, she needn't worry. Her reaction was just the involuntary twitch of overwrought nerves. The talk began again, the bright chatter that tried so hard to hide the constant unvoiced prayer. Please, oh please God, let this war end. Make this senseless killing stop. Turn the Eglani back to where they came from, and let us go back to the ways of peace we know and love. The prayer, Ellen thought bitterly, didn't have a ghost of a chance of being answered. God apparently was on the side of the biggest fleet and the best battle discipline, and neither of these was the property of the Confederation. For centuries men had travelled the star lanes unopposed. Intelligent races were seldom encountered, and those that were always on a lower technological level than the outward sweeping hordes of Earth. They could be safely ignored and their worlds bypassed. There were plenty of others without intelligent life. Colonies were planted, civilizations were built, wealth was produced, traded, and exploited, and in time a loosely organized confederation was established, a glorified board of trade that advised rather than governed. And as system after system passed by default into mankind's hands, the idea grew that the galaxy was man's oyster, and the Creator had graciously provided him with a knife. At that, there was some justice in the thought. An expanding civilization meeting no obstacles for centuries is unlikely to believe the minority of Cassandras. So when the expanding front of humanity collided with that of the Eglani, the first reaction was disbelief, the second panic, and the third grim anger. But anger was not enough. Mankind was trying desperately, but 1,000 years of peaceful expansion were poor experience to pit against an organized race of warlike conquerors. The war wasn't going too well. Even the communiques had stopped calling the shrinking sphere of human power strategic withdrawals and tactical regroupments. Nowadays, they either didn't mention the loss of another world or published the new frontier line without comment. Long ago, the dent in mankind's expanding perimeter had become a bulge, and the bulge a dome that cut inexorably into the worlds of the Confederation. Slowly, man's domination of this sector of the galaxy was being blotted out. In slightly more than 5 years, 100 Confederation worlds had fallen into the hands of the Eglani as the Confederation evacuated and withdrew, bartering precious space and lives for infinitely more precious time to forge the weapons and battle skills to crush the aliens. Ellen knew all this, but it didn't seem important. What mattered was that her man was out there on the frontier fighting the Eglani. She wanted him home with all the blind possessive selfishness of her sex. She wanted to feel his arms around her, and later in the quiet of the home to tell him what he had a right to know. She laid down her cards and ran the hands over her abdomen with a curious half-protective, half-possessive gesture, a wry smile touching her lips. She was doing her part, just as Alton was doing his. Life was needed. Life had to be replaced. Another keening shriek from the sky. Another ship was in. And Ellen was standing up. Her face was glory. "It's Alton," she said with odd softness. "I'd know the sound of those drives anywhere in the galaxy." And then, quietly, she fainted. Within minutes after landing, interrogation teams from Central Intelligence swarmed over ship and crew like vultures on a dead carcass. For hours, the questioning and examination went on, and not until the last tape, the last instrument, and the last crewman of the Dauntless had been wrung dry of information did the torture stop. Literally nothing was overlooked, but the results, as usual, were negative. 3 strikes, 3 kills, 2 boardings, and nothing to show for them but Eggland corpses. As usual, the aliens were thorough. They fought while they could, and died when they could fight no more, and headless bodies were no use to Central Research. Reluctantly, Intelligence released the officers and crew. The Eggland enigma was no closer to solution than it was 5 years ago when the aliens had blasted a Confederation exploration ship and had started the war. But Commander Alton Fisk wasn't worried about that. Ellen was out there, waiting for him, and he'd been delayed too long already. A week is never long at best, and this had been shorter than most, Fisk decided as he picked up a ground car at Fleet Headquarters and directed the driver to take him to his quarters. It was a little better than an hour until blastoff, which would give him time enough to pick up his kit and say goodbye to Ellen for the 4th time. He had been lucky. The Dauntless needed modification and repair, and the weak planetside was his longest time ashore since his honeymoon. Of course, Ellen wasn't going to like his sudden departure, but she was a Navy wife, and she knew what she was getting into before they were married. It was an abiding wonder that she had married him in the face of his Cassandra prophecies of trouble and heartache. But then, Ellen was an unusual woman. As he left the forbidding grimness of Fleet Headquarters, he almost smiled. In a way, it was a relief to get away from the long-faced brass whose professionally preoccupied air was merely a camouflage for the worry that ate at the linings of their stomachs. Fisk was glad that he wasn't one of the ulcer echelon, that his worries involved relatively simple things such as fighting a ship and getting home alive. As it was, the pain of leaving again was bad enough, and if it weren't for Ellen's get-togethers, it would be greater. They were the one fault in her otherwise perfect character. How a perfectly sane and sensible woman could endure those gab-fests where every blessed female was talking at the same time was more than he could understand. But Ellen not only took them in her stride, she took them 3 or 4 times a week. His face clouded as he saw the squadron of ground cars parked before his quarters. Their significance was obvious. Of course, she didn't expect him home this early in the day, and if she'd known of the orders he'd received, there probably would have been no one here but her. Still, he'd have to go inside and face that crowd of cats mewling at each other over some conversational bone. He sighed as he stepped out of the car, told the driver to wait, and walked the few steps to his quarters. Through the clatter of shrill voices, the squealing giggle of Anne Albertson cut like a knife, piercing his ears as he stood in the tiny entrance hall, reluctant to enter farther, yet unwilling to leave. He winced. Sure, Anne probably had a right to squeal. Her husband had landed his riddled ship yesterday morning and had walked away from the wreckage. Sure, she had a right to squeal, but did she have to do it in his house? Fixing his expression into a non-committal mask, he stepped into the living room, and with his appearance the noise stopped. 12 pairs of eyes looked at him, and Anne Albertson said into the silence, "I think we'd better leave, girls. We're not needed here right now." There was a murmur and a rustle, and miraculously the room was empty except for Ellen. She stood in front of him, a slim, straight girl with a face that was oddly white against the wealth of her blue-black hair. She wasn't pretty, Fisk thought. She was beautiful. "Are you off again?" Ellen asked. Fisk nodded. Wives, he suspected, were telepathic. "Admiral Koenig should go drown himself," she said bitterly. "He has no right to send you off like this. You've been home only 6 days. "That's twice as long as last time," Fisk pointed out reasonably. He felt proud of her. She was pure steel all the way through. No tears, no fuss, even a faint smile on her lips. If possible, he loved her more than ever. "If you don't like it," he continued with a wry grin, "you might take it up with the Admiral." "Not me," Ellen said. "The one time I saw him at close range, he scared me half to death." "Oh well, you needn't worry. It's just another try for prisoners. The Research Institute wants a live Eglin." "Haven't they got some? Ed Albertson came in with a few last trip." "Those were civilians. The labs want a military man or two. There's a lot of differences between the Eglin military and civilians that don't make sense. All they'd need to do is look at our fighting men. There's a lot of differences between them and civilians that don't make sense." Fisk grinned. "Anyway, it's a milk run this time." He lied. "Don't kid the troops on the home front," she said. "It's a big, mean and dirty." "It's no worse than any other mission. Sure, they're all bad, but I'm on detached assignment, and there won't be a lot of other ships around cluttering up space and drawing attention." "I wish they'd leave us alone." "So do I. But these mule-eared Eglin militarists aren't going to be satisfied until we pin their ears back." "I suppose so, but I don't like to think of you out there." "Someone has to go," he said quietly. "And besides, I've always managed to come back. I'm getting pretty good at it now." He kissed her lightly on the end of her nose. "Just keep on being good," she said. "I like having you around." She kissed him then, a fierce, hungry kiss that left him breathless. "All right, sailor. There's something for you to come home to. Now let's get your gear together." Ellen followed him to the door. "I'm not going down to the field with you this time," she said. "Last time was enough. I don't think I could stand watching you disappear outside again. But I made something to take with you." She picked up a square, flat package from the top of the recorder and thrust it into his hands. "Another tape like the last one?" he queried. "Not exactly like the last one," she smiled, "but it's along the same lines. You said you liked the other." "I did. It was nice to hear your voice. And would you believe I never grew tired of hearing it? It gets lonely out there." "It gets lonely here too. Now off with you, or I'll be tempted to kidnap you for the duration." She kissed him, a cool, wifely kiss that was tender but passionless, pushed him gently away, and stood beside the door until his car disappeared around the corner on its way back to the base. She sighed and turned back to the house. That was all it was now, just a house. But for the past week it had been a home. She wondered when, if ever, it would be a home again. It was starting already. The worry, the hidden fear, the agony of suspenseful waiting. She jumped as the doorbell rang, and Anne Albertson's face appeared in the viewplate. "I came back," Anne said as she entered the room. "I thought you might need me, and besides, I forgot something." She looked at the recorder with an odd expression on her pointed face. "Well," she said finally, "I didn't think anyone wanted it worse than I did. I thought it might amuse Ed. He's pretty low. He lost a lot of men." "Wanted what?" Ellen asked curiously. "That recording I made of the first part of our get-together. I left it lying on top of the recorder, but it isn't there now." Ellen gasped and put the back of her hand to her mouth. "Oh no," she said in a strangled voice. Anne looked at her curiously. "I gave it to Alton," Ellen said. "I thought it was the one I made for him." "Oh well, he shouldn't mind. Your voice is on it too." "You don't know Alton," Ellen said miserably. As the Dauntless bored through Seath space in the middle blue component, Fisk reviewed his last meeting with Admiral Koenig. It hadn't been too satisfactory. Central Research, it seemed, still wanted a live Eglin trooper. It didn't matter that the Navy hadn't captured one in 5 years of trying. The requirement still stood. It took no great intelligence to understand why Central wanted a prisoner. A great deal about the aliens could be understood if there was live meat available. The only trouble was that there never had been, and probably never would be, a live Eglin prisoner of war. Fisk automatically excluded the Eglin civilians. They were essentially no different than a civilized human. It puzzled Fisk how a people who were gentle, civilized, and understanding could produce a warrior caste so fiercely dedicated and so utterly different was a mystery he couldn't solve. Sure, some of it probably was connected with the suicide devices surgically implanted in their skulls, but that wasn't all of it. Their fanatic will to fight, their utter disregard of death, and their incredible discipline had no reflection in their civilian counterparts. The Eglin soldiery were a living denial of the human axiom that a society left its impression upon all of its components. Certainly there was no reflection of the Eglin civilian in the Eglin soldier, or vice versa. Fisk shrugged. After all, it wasn't his problem outside of the fact that he had to fight them, and it had been proven some time ago that ship for ship, humanity was fully a match for the aliens. It was only when groups were involved that the Eglin superiority was apparent. And then it was overwhelming. There was some trick of discipline or communication that welded a group of Eglin fighting ships into a single cohesive unit that was thus far unbeatable. Humanity had to learn, or it was lost, and would go the way of the other civilizations that had been in the path of alien conquest. Fisk shrugged. Given time, men might learn the answer. But time was getting short. Koenig felt that if the answer wasn't found soon, humanity would pass the point of no return. Already the inner worlds were glutted with refugees. Industry was trying vainly to gain upon the tremendous attrition in ships and weapons and still supply the population. Financial structures were tottering on the brink of ruin. Taxation was oppressive, restrictions were galling and unpleasant, and everywhere disaffection with the progress of the war was rampant.
"If the armchair admirals had their way," Koenig had said bitterly, "we'd be through now. But we can't hold out much longer. This delaying policy is going to split wide open. We're going to be forced to mount a counter-offensive against an enemy we know can outmaneuver and outfight us in large formations. An enemy who knows a great deal about us, but about whom we know nothing. We simply have to get a line on how they operate." So here he was again, chasing the will-o'-the-wisp of an Eglin prisoner. He sighed, shrugged, and turned his attention to the banks of instruments that recorded every vital function of the ship. This part of the voyage was easy. Not even the inhumanly efficient Eglani could guard all parts of the fluid hemisphere they had pushed into the territory of the Confederation, and ships travelled with relative ease across the ill-defined border that separated the two warring races. But life aboard ship was neither easy nor relaxed. Under Fisk's command, it was a constant striving for perfection. 5 years of battle experience had taught him that neither officers nor crew could become too familiar with the offensive and defensive armaments of a ship, Constant practice was the only answer to Eglin coordination, and every man aboard knew that the more proficient they became, the better were their chances of coming home alive. So all hands spent every spare moment refining skills of war, solving simulated tactical problems, trying to increase response speed and improve combat efficiency. Fisk checked the control console, his eyes sweeping across the lights and dials that indicated the Dauntless was manned and ready, and that the crew were at their proper stations. Satisfied that everything was in order, he set up a tactical problem on the board and buzzed for the executive officer. "Take over, Oli," he said, as the exec slid into the chair beside him. A stinker you leave me," Olaf Pedersen remarked as his eyes scanned the board. "I'll be in quarters if you need help," Fisk said. He pushed off in a flat dive toward the hatch that led to his quarters as Pedersen took up the problem and the drill went on. As ship commander, he enjoyed the priceless luxury of privacy, and for the little time that remained before breakout, he would luxuriate in solitude and listen to what Ellen taped for him. It was a pleasure he had carefully saved for this moment before they went into action. He hoped that it was something gay and inspiring, perhaps with a little of the affection they had for each other. But whatever it would be Ellen's voice, and for a while it would give him the illusion that she was near. He webbed into his shock couch, threaded the spool of tape into the playback, and flipped the switch. For a few seconds the tape hummed quietly through the guides. Then a blast of noise erupted from the speaker. Anne Albertson's piercing giggle. Laughter. Voices, piercing female voices pitched at the most irritating level, a cacophonous clatter through which snatches of treble phrases sliced with nerve-jangling shrillness. Fisk's howl could be heard through the entire forward part of the ship. He reached out angrily to turn off the playback, but even as he did, he hesitated. Ellen must have given him this tape for a reason, and it was obvious that he was missing it. She wasn't the sort to play practical jokes. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself to listen to the gabble that rasped his ears and frayed his temper. It was the quintessence of irritation, a garbled, calm-destroying jangle that had all the comfort of a dental drill grinding out an infected molar. And then he heard it. The background noise died a little, and across the disconnected chatter came Ellen's voice, clear, crisp and light, mouthing the same banalities as the others. It was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. And then he understood. For behind her voice a pattern emerged, a pattern that was neither light, nor gay, nor superficial. It was a desperate clinging to the familiar little things that made up normal life, a deliberate avoidance of the war, the fear, and the worry. And Fisk realized with an odd feeling of surprise that here was a counterpart of the wardroom gabfests aboard ship. The attitude was the same. There was no essential difference. He stood it until her voice faded into the background, and then he turned off the playback. Ellen should have known that he understood how she felt. There was no need for this. He felt oddly cheated as he put the tape away in his locker and returned to the control room. The Dauntless broke out of hyperspace travelling just under Loom 1, well within Eglin territory. Fisk knew from experience that the enemy detectors were efficient and it was always risky to break out into normal space, but he had to come out to get a fix on potential targets. "Set," the gunnery officer said. Instantly the Dauntless slammed back into force space. The scan had taken barely 10 seconds, and with reasonable luck, the dip into normal space would remain unnoticed long enough to give them the advantage of surprise. At best, such an advantage would be fleeting. At worst, he would break out in the middle of an Eglin trap. Actuality would probably be somewhere in between. He'd have perhaps 20 minutes, and in that time he'd have to accomplish his mission
and get the Dauntless back into the relative safety of force space. The world ahead was a small planet about 2/3 the size of Earth, and from it came the persistent radiation of nuclear stockpiles and atomic machinery. There was a base here, a big one supported by a massive industrial complex. The Eglani had the habit of concentrating their works, which made for greater efficiency of operation, but also made them far more remunerative targets. There was no waiting. The cruiser flashed into normal space-time, a bank of red lights blossomed on the control board, and the gunnery officer launched a salvo of torpedoes at the Eglan base. The torps were new. Each carried a tiny hyperspace converter that pushed them up into the lower orange. They would arrive on target milliseconds after they were launched, break out into normal space, and detonate. They were tricky things that required nearly 10 seconds data to adjust, but when properly set, they could materialize within any fixed screen. The inherent qualities of force space made them useless against maneuvering ships, but against a city or a planetary base, they were deadly. Of course, compartmentalized screening would reduce the damage, but if the Eglani were using a hemisphere, God help anything inside. Air screamed around the hull as the cruiser slammed into the planet's upper atmosphere, her jets thundering to match intrinsics with the planet. Within minutes, the Banshee's screech faded away, and the cruiser hung motionless in the upper air. Over the rim of the world, behind them, an awesome pillar of mushroom-capped cloud rose into the sky. "Scratch one, Eglan base!" an anonymous voice in fire control yelped joyfully. "Stow that! Silence down there!" Fisk barked. "Airboat at 0025, a spotter announced. "Hedge-hopping. Forward batteries ready." "Use a force rod," Fisk ordered. "I want that ship intact." The pale lance of a paramagnetic beam clawed through the atmosphere and struck the airboat. Driven by the awesome power of the cruiser's generators, it struck, clung, and wrenched the airship from its slow path through the sky. Instantly, all jamming devices in the cruiser flicked on, ripping the air with a blast of interference that filled all the nearer reaches of space. "Quarter drive, vertical," Fisk ordered, and the cruiser leaped upward, dragging the airboat behind it into the airless outer regions where the beam could operate more effectively. "Okay, boys, pull her in." The bored voice of the gunner's mate in the forward blister came over the intercom, and a moment later the fragile shell of the airboat thudded against the armoured hull of the cruiser. "Boarders away," Fisk ordered. The boarding party, specifically trained for this operation, opened the airlocks, carved the side of the airboat, and dove into the crowded interior. The Eglani, caught without spacesuits, smashed to the floor of their craft by uncompensated acceleration. Their air lost in a mighty rush, still tried to resist. Space is not immediately lethal, and by holding their breath, several managed to fire a few hand blasts at the incoming boarders. But it was useless. The beams clawed futilely at the heavy armor, and the return fire carved a smoking path through the packed bodies. Then the living died to join the already mutilated dead as tiny explosions limned their heads with momentary brightness. Fisk sighed at the familiar carnage visible in the view screen. Another abortion. But he had expected it. No one yet had caught a living Eglan soldier, and he didn't think that he'd be the first to do so. Young Lieutenant Fitzhugh, commanding the party, stepped up to the signalman's scanner and reported, "They're all dead, sir. We have no casualties." "All right, disengage and return," Fisk said as the signalman scanned the piled headless heap of short-legged, long-bodied aliens. One still had a face. The wide mouth, prehensile proboscis, and mule ears were still intact, but the back was gone from its head. The face had a mask-like quality as it glared up at him with bulging eyes half-driven from the cavernous sockets. "Aye, sir." Lieutenant Fitzhugh turned away from the scanner, and one by one the men came back along the boarding line to the cruiser's airlock. The scanner flicked off as the signalman made his way back. Enemy on starboard beam. The talker's voice was lost in clangor of alarms and a thudding concussion as the entire starboard battery erupted one simultaneous blast of destruction at the Eglin cruiser, which had suddenly emerged a scant 5 miles away. The Eglin was quick, inhumanly quick in his reaction. He had broken out much too close, but even so his primary screens flared an instant before the broadside struck. But no primary screen ever built could stand alone against the megatons of energy that instantaneously erupted against it. Screen and ship disappeared in the hellish blast, reduced instantly to glowing radioactive gas. The enormous fireball licked hungrily toward the Dauntless as the automatic controls promptly took her back into hyperspace. Lieutenant Fitzhugh, still 10 feet from the open airlock, saw the flare of the explosion and the premonitory shudder of the ship. He knew that he didn't have time enough to make it. With the strength of desperation, he threw the object he carried toward the rapidly closing airlock as the ship vanished from sight and the searing fireball enveloped his body. He never had time to decide whether his aim had been true or not. Fisk looked at the Eglin head Lockman Vornov was holding up to his viewplate. The man was talking. "He was still outside when we hypered, sir, but he threw this in through the airlock. It hit me on the leg, sir." For the first time, Fisk really understood the term mixed emotion. He was feeling it now. Regret at Fitzhugh's death was exactly balanced by the wild hope that the impossible might have happened, that the head was that of an Eglin soldier rather than a civilian. Certainly Fitzhugh wouldn't have brought it back unless he had good reason to suspect that it might be useful, nor would he have tried so desperately to get it aboard ship. "Get that thing down to Doc Bonner," he ordered, "and tell him that I'll be along in a minute." Old Doc Bonner, who derived his nickname from combat rather than chronological age, looked inquiringly at Fisk. "Should I post it or pickle it?" he asked. "Post it. It might blow up before we reach home. Get to work." "It's a point," Bonner admitted, "but it might not be too valid with headquarters. Since it hasn't exploded by now, it probably won't." Fisk shook his head. "There's no sense in taking chances. Besides, it might belong to a civilian." "Not this baby," Bonner said. "It's military." He indicated a white line at the base of the skull. "That's where they blow up," he said. "There's a charge implanted there. And besides, it's as you say, sir. We shouldn't take chances." Bonner laid out a row of shining instruments, turned on the visual recorder over the table, and went to work. Must have been quite a bit of dissection here," he commented as he inspected the back of the head. "Poor job of suturing, and lots of fibrous connective tissue, but it's healed well enough." He cut in delicately with a scalpel. "Uh-oh, pay dirt. Now wait a minute. Let's find out where these leads go. That'd be the spinal accessory nerve if this head were human, but with this fellow it might be anything." He swung an autocamera into place and took a series of still pictures, probed the skull for a moment with a pair of long-jawed forceps, and lifted out a tiny translucent capsule with a fused dark globule dangling below it. "Ah, here we are." He placed the capsule carefully in a cotton-lined pan. "You'd better get that thing down to engineering," he said. "That's not my line. I'll finish this post while you're gone. I might find something of interest to report in the medical journal. Incidentally, that capsule was linked to the nerve over a micropore graft. I'm keeping that part for microdissection. It wouldn't do you any good." Fisk took the pan and left the surgery. Doc was right. This was the part that was his baby, not that ball of meat in there on the tray. Chief Engineer Sandoval took the pan gingerly. Setting it on a bench, he peered at it thoughtfully. "A sealed unit," he said. "We'll X-ray it first, and maybe then we can do something about it." "Better disconnect that detonator, or the damn thing may blow your head off," Fisk advised. "Don't try to tell me my business, Skipper." Sandoval grinned. "I was doing this when you were in knee pants. You go back and run the ship, and me and my boys will find out what makes this tick." Fisk grinned with mild embarrassment. "Okay, Sandy, I'm off to the ivory tower. Pass the word when you find what cooks." "Sure thing." Bonner reported nothing new on the brain. "It'll make a nice paper," he said, "but that's all. In fact, I'd surmise our own are a trifle more complex than theirs if convolutions have anything to do with mental power. The Eglin brain is rather simple in some aspects, but of course, it's the relative weights of brain and cord that really count." "You're way over my head," Fisk said. "Incidentally, what did engineering find out about that gadget?" "No report as yet. I'll let you know if anything develops." Fisk cut Doc off the intercom as Chief Sandoval came in. Fisk looked at his grim face curiously. "What's the trouble?" "Nothing. That's the hell of it. I've been kicking myself for not figuring it out before. That gadget's nothing but a fined-up subetheric communicator. We used them before the Lorcom was developed. There's an explosive charge, but the arming mechanism was burned off, and that's it." "Not quite," Fisk said. "There was a direct neural connection, and that's why they fight as a unit. A ship's commander would have a complete charge of his ship like a brain with 100 bodies, and he's probably hooked up with a squadron CO, and the squadron CO—" "What a system!" Fisk cut off and twisted the selector. "Communications," he said. "Aye, sir. Contact Chief Engineer Sandoval, tape his data, and send it to Prime." "Sorry, sir, can't be done." "What?" "Yes, sir. There's an interference blanket in sheath that you can't drive anything through. I've been trying to raise base for an hour." "When did this come on? Why wasn't I informed?" "It came on about an hour ago, and you were busy. We've never had anything like this before, sir. I thought I'd like to punch a beam through it before I quit." "All right. Break out the message torps, tape the data, and send them off." "But—" "That's all, Lieutenant. Get cracking." "Aye, sir." "Well, that's a new wrinkle," Fisk observed. "They've figured out our Lorcom, and we're jammed." Pedersen looked up from the control board. Doesn't smell so good. They wouldn't jam us unless they had something else up their sleeves. They're figuring on stopping us, no doubt." Fisk nodded. "I thought of that. But how?" "Damned if I know, but they've got some idea." "Well, two can play at this jamming game, and we'll deal with the other thing when it comes." Fisk dialed Sandoval. "Sandy," he said as the engineer's face appeared on the screen, "can your boys build an all-wave subetheric broadcaster?" "Yes and no," Sandoval said. "We can build one, but we're not able to. No components." "How about modifying the Lorcom?" "That wouldn't be too tough, but you can't be thinking of—" "How long would it take?" 20 hours minimum. You realize, of course, that it's going to deprive us of long-range communications." "All right, so we lose them. They're worthless anyway. We're being jammed. Now get going on that conversion and cut all the time you can." "Aye, sir." Sandoval's boys must have sweated blood, Fisk thought, for it was barely 22 hours before the chief's heavy voice came over the intercom. "It's finished, sir," Sandoval said. "We're ready to roll." "Good," Fisk replied. "What's the output?" "A kilowatt across the board." Not so good. We're not going to blanket much with that." "You'll get through all right, but you can't expect any more than that. If you want to jam, you'd better concentrate on the 1400 band. You can smother anything in that area." "No, I'd rather have full coverage. I think the nosies are laying for us, and I want something that'll affect every Eglin in range, not just part of them. If we confuse them enough, we can crack straight through before they recover." "What do you intend to use to cause this confusion?" Sandoval asked. A grin crossed Fisk's face. "We might put a signal man on the mic and give them the latest box scores of the Tri-World League mixed with double talk, or a linguist could issue phony orders in Eglinese." Sandoval grinned in answer. "Sneaky, isn't it? This business of hoisting the engineers on their own petards. Personally, I favour music.
Some of these squirm combos the boys listen to would drive a saint out of heaven.
Fisk chuckled. It's an idea, and not a bad one at that. Angelo Bodoni and the Signal Section has some progressive squirm recordings that'll make your hair curl. We'll make him a disc jockey as soon as we have some Eglani to try it on.
You won't have to wait long, sir, Pedersen said, as he swiveled his chair to face Fisk. Detectives report a disturbance in sea green about 10 hours ahead. Looks like a couple of Class 1 cruisers, not ours.
What's their bearing?
They're moving along our line, slightly under our component.
Fisk leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. He looked at Pedersen and nodded.
Battle stations, condition 2, Pedersen said to the talker. Well, there's 2 of them down there to try our gadget on.
Give us one break at least, Fisk said. We're not too outnumbered.
Pedersen shrugged off the pun. In your shoes, sir, he said. I'd be tempted to run like hell.
Sure, so am I. But just where would we get a better chance than this? If we're going to fight, we might as well get decent odds.
You call 2 to 1 decent?
I'll tell you more when their drive patterns are analysed. If they're cruisers, we can outgun and outrun them. If they're battle wagons, they'll never catch us. Not even.
Objects register as enemy heavy cruisers, the talker said. Drive intensity 0.02 over ours.
Well, Pedersen remarked, you're wrong on one point. We're not going to outrun them.
Seems that way, Fisk agreed.
They must be new models. Probably ones like those that chewed up Ed Albertson's ship. But they can't be any more heavily armed than we are.
Maybe not, but there's 2 of them, Pedersen said dryly. I would imagine this changes things.
Naturally. We'll run for a while. I'm not risking my ship against those odds if I can help it.
Fisk turned on the command circuit. 180 gyro turn, he said. Execute.
The Dauntless swapped ends and virtually without delay began backtracking across the warps of Sheath space. Since inertia didn't exist in hyperspace, the change in direction was made instantaneously. At maximum blast, the Dauntless began to put space between her and her pursuers, who at once changed course to overtake the fleeing Confederation ship. Hour after hour, the 3 ships drove through the harsh blue monochrome of Upper Sheath, and slowly the distance between pursuers and pursued lessened. Travelling in a great curve that would ultimately take them into Confederation territory, Fisk and Pedersen watched the telltale dots in the spotting tank come closer.
We're not going to make it, Fisk said finally. They'll catch or pass us before we hit the frontier.
Nice, Pedersen replied. With one ahead matching our opponent and sowing mines, and the other behind and above us just in case we try to drop out. We've got about the same chance as a snowball in hell.
It's not quite that bad. We have weapons, and we've got the broadcaster. They won't be expecting it, and if we drop into normal space looking like we want to fight, I'll bet they'll follow us.
Sure they will.
They'll get a surprise then. How'd you like to be wearing one of those cute little communicators and get a blast of Bordoni's progressive squirm the minute you make breakout?
I wouldn't.
I'm betting that they won't either.
Fisk turned to the talker.
All hands, battle stations, full armor, condition 1. Bordoni, stand by with your recordings. Report when ready.
A cold ball bounced in Fisk's stomach as the reports snapped in. Up until now, the Confederation ships had been individually superior to the aliens, an advantage that barely counterbalanced the Eglani's coordination. But these ships were superior to his own in speed at least, and what they might lack in firepower, they made up in numbers. No skipper in his right mind would tackle 2 to 1 odds in favour of the aliens. But it was unavoidable now. Fisk shrugged. If he was right about the effect of his broadcaster, he had a chance. But the chance was a slim one any way you looked at it. Sure, he knew the secret of Eglan coordination, but could he disrupt that coordination? It was a distinct possibility that his attempt at jamming would only be a minor annoyance, and if it was, the secret of the Eglani would die with him. Of course, there was a possibility that one of the message torpedoes would get through, but torpedoes travelling on a fixed course were usually intercepted and destroyed. At best, they were a forlorn hope, sent earthward more as a gesture than with any expectation of arrival. And with the Lawcom converted to a sub-etheric broadcaster, he had no exterior communications. The Dauntless was on her own, cut off from help, wholly dependent upon the skill of her crew for survival. "Stand by for breakout," Fisk ordered. "Execute." Smoothly, the ship swapped ends, halted instantly, and dropped like a stone through the sheathed components as Sandoval cut the converters. With scarcely a shudder, the Dauntless slipped into normal space. "Full ahead," Fisk ordered, and familiar acceleration clutched at the bodies of the crew. With every electronic and visual sense extended, screens glowing on standby, drives flaring a fierce blue against the dark of space, the Dauntless swept forward toward the frontier far ahead. Her speed was less than a snail's crawl compared to the inconceivable velocities she had been travelling in Seath, but in normal space-time, weapons functioned and sub-etheric communicators worked. Here, fighting was an art, refined by years of drill and practice. "Bearing 024, enemy cruiser, range 2000, closing," the talker said. "Bearing 190, nega cruiser, range 1500, extending." "Not too smart," Fisk observed. "That rear ship will have to hyper to get ahead of us, and by that time we should get a crack at our long-eared friends up ahead." "Bearing 018, range 1000, closing. Bearing 190, negative," the talker interrupted. "Our little follower's gone back into Seath," Pedersen said. "Gives us 3 minutes at least before he can adjust on us." "Bearing 016, range 500, closing," the talker said. "Stand by, all stations," Fisk said calmly. "Bearing 016, steady. Range 400, 300, 250, 220, 200, 180. The talker's metallic voice was flat in the tense silence of the ship. "At my command," Fisk said as he poised his finger over a large red button on the control console. Over the complex network of spotting, ranging and computing devices, electronic orders flowed into the gun and torpedo stations. Servos hummed as the weapons aligned on the target, and gun crews alertly followed the movements of the automatics ready for emergencies or malfunctions. "Bearing 013, range 50, closing." The talker's unemotional voice continued. Fisk's hand stabbed the button, and an instant later the Dauntless yawed violently to the blast of fire that erupted from every weapon capable of bearing on the Eglin. "Enemy has fired," the talker said. The Dauntless slewed violently as the pilot took evasive action. For a long second, the Eglin hung in space, her screens blazing. Then she began to turn, but it was too late. The concentrated fury of the Dauntless's broadside erupted against her screens in blazing pyrotechnics. The Eglin staggered and spun off at a tangent. A second later, the Dauntless bucked and jumped as the Eglin's fire crashed home. The secondary screens flared and vanished. The primaries crackled into the violet under the enormous load of dissipating the megatons of energy that flared against them. "Holy George! What sort of stuff are those fellows carrying?" Pedersen breathed. "They outgun us, too!" A trickle of blood ran from his nose. "No, we're about even there," Fisk said as another broadside erupted from the Dauntless, and another load of destruction hurtled towards the Eglin. "Enemy has fired," the talker said, and the Dauntlesses again turned off to one side. This time the salvo missed by a comfortable margin. "What's wrong with them?" Pedersen asked as he stared into the tank. "They're not evading." "Maybe they can't. We hit him near the drives." "There they go. Too slow," Way too slow. The dauntless salvo struck, and for a moment an intolerable flame lighted space, and when it died, the Eglin cruiser had vanished. "Bearing 045, enemy cruiser, range 100, closing," the talker's voice interjected. "Enemy has fired." The Dauntless yawed violently as Fisk stabbed at the Sith switch. The familiar quivering shook them as the ship clawed at the edge of hyperspace, and simultaneously a pile-driver blow struck them astern, tearing crewmen from their safety webs and slamming them with bone-crushing force against unyielding plates and bulkheads. The Dauntless rang like a giant gong, the sound disappearing slowly with shimmering reverberations that assumed tangible shapes as a harsh red of lower Sith closed around them. "Skipper," the ship intercom rattled. "We can't hold her here. Number 3 converter's dismounted and there's a hole in the engine room big enough to drive a truck through." "Enemy cruiser, Sith yellow, dead ahead, dropping to our component," the talker said. "Well, we got one of them," Peterson said. "Might as well take our medicine like good boys. He'll be sowing mines in a minute." "That Eglin was cold meat," Fisk said. "The broadcast worked." "That second ship wasn't. They came in on us like a hawk at a chicken," Pedersen answered. "They didn't have time to get the full benefit of it." "You're going to give them another chance?" "We'll have to. We can't stay here. We can't run, and up here the broadcaster doesn't work, so we go down again. With that noise of Bodoni's, we should be able to jar their back teeth loose. Which reminds me, I'd better see how he's doing. That broadcaster is pretty near the engine room." He punched the intercom selector. "How's it going, Bodoni?" he asked. An anguished wail came out of the speaker. "I was just changing a platter when we got struck. I sat on them. Even on my Stan Kenton album, and that's a classic. They're busted to hell, all of them." "Bodoni," Fisk snapped. "Sir!" "Valve it off, son. It can't be helped. Have you any more?" "No, sir." "Can you sing or make noise or something?" Fisk asked hopefully. "Negative, sir. I've got mic fright. Always did have." Fisk sighed. "Very well. You're relieved. Report to your station." "Now what?" Peterson asked. "We get something else." "What?" Bodoni had the only squirm aboard. "I know. I shook the ship down. There isn't a thing 1/10 as." "Enemy has matched components," the talker said. "Down 2 shades," Fisk ordered. "We can dodge for a while," he said absently as the ship dropped into a deeper red monochrome. "But he'll get us eventually." "Sir, the engine room broke in." "The converters aren't going to take much more of this. We're on 20% overload right now." "They'll have to take it," Fisk snapped, "if we want to stay alive." "I'll try to keep him going, boss," Sandoval's voice broke in. "Thanks, Andy," Fisk cut off. "Now about the noise business." "Well," Peterson said, "you might try doing it yourself. Seems that I remember you howling like a wounded wolf a few days ago, just before we clobbered that Eglin base. If it's noise you want, why don't we give them out with a few war whoops? You damn near lifted the lid off his can." Fisk's eyes widened. "You have something there," he admitted. He flipped the selector to communications. "George," he said, "can you rig a continuous tape playback into that broadcaster? Bodoni's aborted, smashed his records." "Sure, give me 10 minutes. "Make it 5 and send one of your boys up here. I have a package for him." Fisk switched off and turned to Pedersen. "Have someone go to my quarters and get that roll of sound tape out of my locker. It's in the upper left compartment. Give it to George's man when he shows up." He looked at Pedersen's puzzled expression and grinned. "We're not licked yet, Oli." "Enemy has matched component," the talker said. "Down 2 shades, and keep changing our course. Don't follow one line for more than 10 seconds, Fisk ordered. "That gives us about 4 more drops before we break out," the pilot voice said over the speaker. "And we can't dodge too long. He can outmaneuver us and ride us right out of Seath." "How long?" "Maybe 5 minutes, maybe less." "Well, get on with it. We can't stay here." Fisk looked glumly at the control board. There was nothing he could do at the moment. "Aye, sir." The red monochrome deepened a trifle as the Dauntless dropped closer to breakout. "Damn, they're quick," Fisk muttered. "We're not going to be here long at this rate," Pedersen observed. "We do what we can. Unless we get that broadcast rigged, we've got no chance at all." Fisk lapsed into silence. A minute passed as the Dauntless dodged frantically and the Eglin maneuvered for position. "Enemy has matched component," the talker said. Instantly the Dauntless was surrounded by a reddish-black gloom. "Infraband coming," Pedersen remarked. "Our spotting isn't too good there. He can be on top of us before we know it." "Let's hope theirs isn't either," Fisk answered absently. "Enemy has matched component," the talker said. "Well, that's that," Fisk said with grudging admiration as the ship went dark and began to buck and shudder in the stress area at the border of Seath and normal space. "He's just about kicked us out of commission." A violent shock lifted the cruiser and shook her. Metal screamed and ripped as a ship, struck by a mine at the very edge of Seath, was driven downward through the border into breakout. Flashes and pinwheels of light flamed across Fisk's eyes as the ship spun madly into normal space. The talker wakened him. "Enemy cruiser, range 350, steady." Fisk cursed weakly at the unemotional robot voice. Somewhere amidships, a dull explosion shook the ship, and then the whole mass of the cruiser moved sideways as a broadside let loose. Fisk came to awareness with a jerk. Beside him was Pedersen, his face a bloody mask, calmly operating the control board. A piece of scalp had been stripped neatly from his head and hung down the back of his neck together with the smashed wreckage of his helmet. "Break off, Pete. I'm back. Get a patch on that scalp and a new helmet. You'll look silly breathing space if they hull us up here." "I thought you had it, Skipper." Pedersen grinned through the blood. "That last jump was pretty rough." "What's up?" "I don't know. Our Eglin friend is shooting at us from long range. He doesn't seem very eager to close. Came into 350 and has been matching us ever since. Looks like he's waiting for help." "We can't let this go on. What's our situation?" "Damage control reports we're about 80% effective. They're working on the number 3 converter, but it'll be at least an hour before she's ready. We've lost 2 secondary batteries, but the mains are all right, and our screens are keeping out the stuff our playmate's sending over." "Our drives?" "Okay, except for the converters, like I said." Fisk looked into the plotting tank. "Full right turn," he ordered. "If he won't close, we will." "Skipper!" the intercom chattered. "We got that tape in. We're ready to roll down here." "Well, get going," Fisk snarled. "Do I have to tell you everything?" "No, sir, but we thought—" "Stop thinking and turn that broadcast on." "Yes, sir." 85 degrees, right turn, down 5, Fisk said. "Full drive, execute." He bent over the tank and watched the Eglin. The enemy response was slow. "It's working," Fisk murmured happily. The blindest observer could see that something was wrong with the alien. His maneuvering was sloppy, his fire confused, sporadic, and inaccurate, and as the Dauntless shells crashed into his secondary screens, there were no evasive maneuvers or blazing pyrotechnics of point reinforcement. Fisk grinned ferociously. A few more salvos, and that would be the end of him. A violent blow wrenched the Dauntless sideways, and another hurled her forward with a tremendous burst of acceleration. And the drives stopped dead. Under momentum alone, the cruiser shot onward. "We've had it, boss!" Sandoval's voice came in like a knell of doom. "Torpedo caught us right on the drive lattice. The drives are shot." "Enemy cruiser coming up dead astern," the talker said. "Range 80, closing slowly." The Dauntless lay dead, coasting through space. The faint hiss of escaping air and the clatter of booted feet were the only sounds in the hull. The lights still burned on emergency power, but the drive and the power plant were gone, and with them the Dauntless's capability to fight. Fisk wondered dully what was keeping the ship intact. Somehow the riddled hulk had failed to explode in the sunburst that usually marked the finish of a fighting ship. The guns were silenced. The last mine and torpedo had been fired. The intercom was a shambles of shorted circuits and dead lines. A hole fully a foot across had been ripped through the right side of the control room, giving a free opening onto the blackness of space. One more shell, Fisk thought, and that would be the end of it. But it never came. The Eglin ship matched velocity less than 100 yards away, and a dazed communications officer reported, "Sir, they've opened a channel. They want to surrender." Fisk looked at Pedersen. Pedersen looked at Fisk. The blank incomprehension on the face of one was precisely matched in the face of the other. This was incredible. The Eglin was still in fighting trim. The Dauntless was a wreck. Yet the aliens were offering to surrender, and they never surrendered. "A trap?" Pedersen asked. "Why, they've got us. We're helpless and they know it." Fisk turned to the intercom. "Tell them we accept. Tell them to lower their screens and prepare to receive boarders." He turned to Pedersen. "Wonder how we're fixed for a boarding party. You have an idea?" Pedersen shook his head. "I'm going to have a look." Fisk removed his safety harness and rose stiffly from his chair, moving painfully toward the manway that left aft to the main gun batteries and the drives. He passed shambles. Bodies were everywhere. The sickbay had been destroyed by a direct hit. Guns and torpedo mounts were twisted wreckage garnished with dead. The communications center was miraculously untouched, still operating on emergency power, still broadcasting over the all-wave transmitter as the endless tape ran and reran through its guides. A hulking figure was bent over the transmitter, working with torch and welding rod resetting tie-downs broken by concussion. With dull surprise, Fisk recognized Sandoval. The big man saw him and grinned feebly. It was a miracle that they hadn't been opened up, but his battered armor was intact, except for several minor rips covered with patches and sealant. His helmet was dented, and the short-range communicator at his back was shot away. Fisk shook his head as he approached and laid his helmet against the engineer's. Sandoval's voice came through. "I've got what's left of my boys working on the drive. Give us an hour, and we'll be moving again." "Call them off, Sandy. There's no need. The Eglin has surrendered." "They've what?" "Surrendered. Quit. Given up. We've won." "You're sure you're not in shock, Skipper?" "Just get your men together. We've got to make up a boarding party out of this mess somehow. We've got to collect the wounded and get them out of this wreck. Since the Eglin's still intact, we'll take over his ship." "But Skipper, everybody knows that the Eglani don't." "Break it off, Sandy, and do as you're told. That's an order." Shaking his head, the big man floated off as Fisk shrugged and turned upward toward the gun decks, picking his way through torn and splintered metal, collecting survivors and issuing orders similar to those he had given Sandoval. In the next 20 minutes, Fisk destroyed forever his carefully built reputation for compassion and humanity. They assembled on the main deck. What was left of them? The whole and the wounded, barely 30 men of a crew that had numbered over 100. They gathered in a tight knot, staring into the vision screen that gave a clear view of the alien drawn up alongside. The Eglin ship hung black and massive in space, her seamless side blank save only for the circle of yellow light that marked an open airlock. No glitter of screens reflected the icy glint of the stars. There was a stillness about the ship that was almost frightening as she edged slowly closer to the battered sides of the Dauntless. "Boarders away," Fisk ordered, and the motley group of survivors towing the wounded who still lived opened the airlock and pushed off across the intervening space that separated the two ships. Fisk waited until the last man disappeared into the circle of light in the Eglin's side before pushing off. He blinked once or twice to clear the traces of moisture from his eyes as he looked around the empty stillness that had been his ship. It wouldn't do at all for his men to suspect that besides being a softy, He was a crybaby to boot. The Eglin had a double airlock, and as he emerged through the second airtight valve, he was met by Olaf Pedersen. Pedersen's helmet was off, and there was a peculiar expression on his face. "Well, what did you find?" Fisk asked, anxiety in his voice. "She's all ours. There's no fight left in them," Pedersen said. His voice was oddly strained. "We just moved in and took over. The men are collecting the prisoners now. What's left of them." He pointed down the low, wide manway that led into the interior of the ship. "Control room's down there," he said. "I know." Fisk looked around curiously. The ship was like the other captured jobs he'd seen. Even the 2 decapitated Iglani on the deck were familiar, and the other enemy dead he passed on the way to the control room were not abnormal. One expected to see them in a captured Eglin ship. It was the living who were strange, tight-faced, thick-bodied, stiffly erect aliens and their human guards who stood in the cross passageways watching him as he passed. Fisk shivered. He had never in his life seen eyes so hell-haunted as those the Iglani turned on him. The aliens looked like they would shatter at a touch, brittle shells held intact by a force greater than their wills. "Gives you the creep, doesn't it?" Pedersen asked in a low voice. "It's worse than anything I've ever seen," Fisk replied. "These people are on the edge of collapse. This is chaos." The feeling of brittle tension increased as they entered the control room in the center of the ship. A short, wide Eglin stood beside the master console. He raised his arm in what was obviously a salute, which Fisk punctiliously returned. A muscle in the Eglin's cheek twitched spasmodically. His fingers were clenched, the knuckles white against his greenish skin. "I am Sar Lawton of the Eglin Directorate, commander of this ship," the alien said in fluent Terran. "And I am Commander Alton Fisk of the Confederation Navy," Fisk replied. "I have transferred my men to this ship since you didn't leave much of mine." "For that I am sorry," the Eglin said. "You fought well and deserved a better end. However, you still have won. It is finished." The Eglin smiled bitterly. "You see, Commander, we never knew that war could be such horror. To many of my crew it was too horrible. You undoubtedly saw some of them on your way here." Fisk nodded. "Now about the surrender terms," he began. "There are no terms," the alien said woodenly. "You have won." His face twitched. "Can't you appreciate what your weapon has done? I am an Eglin. An Eglin never surrenders. Yet I and half my crew have surrendered. Don't you appreciate the implications of that? Can't you realize that the Directorate is doomed? That you have won a victory here that is more complete than any we have won in 1,000 years of war? But from birth," the Eglin went on, ignoring the abortive interruption, "we of the warrior caste have been trained to believe that there is no glory other than in battle, that the honor of the Directorate and its supremacy is paramount, that the Directorate must expand to bring the blessings of order to the less favored, that the orders of a superior are to be obeyed unquestioningly, that it is only right that we subordinate ourselves to the greater glory of the Eglin race, that our minds and lives are dedicated to this service, that there is no higher honor, no greater glory than to die for the Eglani." He sounded as though he was reciting a litany that had suddenly become no longer believable. "But this, I find, is wrong. Such a belief is not life. It is death, extinction first of the soul, then of the mind, and finally of the body. Your weapon struck us here at the core of our belief and through our weakest link, a link we had to keep because, paradoxically, it was also the source of our strength and unity. Through our neurocommunications, your feelings, emotions, and beliefs waged battle with our own, and yours won because their truth was more basic and more just than our own. And so we were disarmed. We were confused. We could not hold control. And finally we could not kill, not even ourselves." The muscle in his cheek twitched again. Fisk drew a deep breath. With sudden understanding, he recalled his own feelings when he had heard Ellen on that tape. But there must be more than Ellen. Much more. All those others. And somehow the Eglani had sensed the true meaning behind that nauseous gabble, and the meaning had destroyed them. Of course, this single action wasn't the end of the war, but it was the beginning of the end. The war would go on, but now it wouldn't be humanity with its back against the wall. The Eglani, too, would know the meaning of defeat. Fisk sighed. Somehow he couldn't help feeling sorry for them. They were too understanding. "Thank you," Sir Lawton said unexpectedly. "Your sympathy is appreciated." Fisk looked at him uncomfortably. "Take him away, Ole," he said, "and put him with the others. I'm getting this crate out of here." Fisk sank into the control chair and scanned the board. There was no problem here. He knew Eglon's centralized controls almost as well as his own. One man could operate this ship as necessary, although it took many others to fight and service it. He energized the drives, and the ship moved ahead. The view screens glowed, framing star-studded space and the battered shape of the Dauntless falling slowly astern. The old girl lay quietly, coasting through space, gleaming faintly in the cold light of the distant stars. Slowly she shrank to a toy as the Eglon ship moved away. It was time, Fisk thought, as he adjusted a vernier dial and pushed a small lever. The faint iron trail of the torpedo shone like a pale sword blade in the darkness, vanishing toward the derelict astern. Seconds passed, and then a gigantic fireball blotted out the stars, and with its dying, the Dauntless was gone, save for a fiercely radiating haze of molecules that spread rapidly outward through circumambient space. Pedersen came in quietly and took a seat opposite Fisk. "The prisoners are secure, sir, and our men are ready for Seath jump," he said. "Good. We'll start familiarization after we reach cruising component." "Aye, sir." "The Dauntless is gone," Fisk said absently as he energized the converters, and the ship shivered at the border of hyperspace. "I know. I saw her die." "She was a good ship." "The best. She won our war." "I hated to kill her, Ole." "I know that too, but you had to do it." Fisk sighed as he took the ship up through the Seath components. It handled smoothly enough, but not as smoothly as the Dauntless. The two men sat silently with the control board between them. Fisk spoke finally. "You know, Ole," he said, "I thought it was a calamity when Bordoni broke his recordings." Pedersen looked at him soberly. "You might still be right," he said. "We're going to win this war now. We're going to win it completely. They can't stop us now we know their weakness." "And that's a calamity?" "Possibly. After all, what are we going to do when we win? What sort of conquerors will we be? How will we treat them and the races they have conquered? We have no precedents. We've bypassed other intelligent races in our sphere. We've left them alone because we didn't know how to handle them. And we knew we didn't know. But we can't leave the Eglani alone. They're going to be our responsibility, and we've never learned to rule." Fisk stared, shrugged, and grinned. "Could be that the Eglani will win after all, even though we defeat them in battle. They have the administrative experience." Pedersen chuckled without humor. "You see what I mean? It may still be a calamity." The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. From the pages of dusty old pulp magazines to your ear.